The history of Great Britain begins long before written records, in a land shaped by shifting ice, rising seas, and early human migration. After the last ice age ended around 800 BC, the retreating glaciers left behind forests, rivers, and fertile valleys. Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge known as Doggerland, which stretched across what is now the North Sea. This natural link allowed people, animals, and plants to move freely between the continent and the island for several millennia. By about 6000 BC, rising sea levels submerged Doggerland, isolating Britain permanently and giving rise to a distinct insular development. Archaeological evidence shows that small hunter-gatherer communities spread across the island, living mainly by fishing, hunting deer and wild boar, and gathering nuts and berries. Their stone tools, shelters, and burial sites at places like Starcar in Yorkshire reveal the adaptation of early Britons to post-glacial environments. These Mesolithic peoples left no written language, but their material culture suggests a complex understanding of the landscape and seasons. By around 4000 BC, farming reached Britain from continental Europe. This shift from hunting to agriculture marks the Neolithic Revolution. Communities began clearing forests, cultivating cereals such as wheat and barley, and domesticating cattle and sheep. Permanent settlements replaced nomadic camps. With this came the first social hierarchies and ritual centers. The remains of long barrows, causewayed enclosures, and chambered tombs, such as West Kennet Long Barrow and Maeshowe, indicate organized labor and religious belief focused on ancestors and natural cycles. The Neolithic period also produced the first monumental architecture in the British Isles, Stonehenge, begun around 3000 BC and developed over several phases, stands as the most famous example. Its alignment with the solstices and its scale demonstrate precise planning and astronomical awareness. Other sites like Avebury, Callanish, and Newgrange in Ireland show that megalithic building was widespread across the islands, suggesting shared cultural or ritual practices across regional groups. Around 2500 BC, metal use arrived, marking the Bronze Age. The introduction of bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, transformed toolmaking, warfare, and trade. Britain possessed valuable tin deposits, particularly in Cornwall, which made it an important node in early European trade networks. Weapons, jewelry, and tools became more sophisticated, while burial customs evolved to include single inhumations in round barrows accompanied by grave goods. Finds such as the Amesbury Archer near Stonehenge provide rare insights into status, craft specialization, and long-distance contact, as isotopic analysis links some individuals to regions as far as Central Europe. The Bronze Age also saw the gradual emergence of regional cultures. Settlements became more organized, often placed near rivers or hilltops. Pottery styles, metalwork, and domestic architecture varied by region, indicating growing local identities within the island. By about 1200 BC, climate shifts and soil exhaustion led to population movement, fortification of settlements, and new patterns of land use. The final centuries of the Bronze Age were marked by social instability and a decline in large-scale monument construction. Around 800 BC, iron technology spread to Britain, ushering in the Iron Age. Iron tools were stronger and more abundant than bronze, encouraging agricultural productivity and population growth. Communities began building hill forts, such as Maiden Castle and Danbury, which served as centers of trade, defense, and administration. Society was tribal, organized around kinship groups ruled by chieftains or warrior elites. Archaeological finds, coins, pottery, and weapons show links with continental Celtic cultures, leading scholars to associate Iron Age Britain with the broader Celtic world of Western Europe. By the 1st century BC, distinct tribes occupied different regions of Britain, including the Catavilani, Iceni, Trinovants, Brigantes, and Silures. They traded metals, salt, and slaves with Gaul, modern France, and minted their own coinage, indicating economic sophistication and political complexity. Coastal tribes interacted with the expanding Roman Republic, which had conquered Gaul by 50 BC. Julius Caesar launched 2 brief expeditions to Britain in 55 BC and 54 BC, recording valuable observations about its people, geography, and customs. Although these invasions achieved no lasting control, they marked the first recorded contact between Britain and the Mediterranean world. By the early 1st century AD, Britain was known to Rome as a land of resources and potential conquest. Trade and diplomacy intensified. Southern tribes developed client relationships with Roman Gaul. At the same time, internal rivalries created instability among native rulers. When the Roman Emperor Claudius sought military prestige and territorial expansion, Britain became his chosen target. In 43 AD, Roman legions crossed the Channel, beginning the documented, literate phase of British history. Thus, before written chronicles or foreign conquest, Britain had already experienced thousands of years of human adaptation, innovation, and exchange. The prehistoric foundation, shaped by isolation, resourcefulness, and gradual cultural layering, set the stage for the island's transformation under Roman rule and its long historical continuity thereafter. The Roman period in Britain begins with a deliberate imperial campaign and ends with the withdrawal of imperial authority. Between those bookends, the island underwent administrative incorporation, infrastructural transformation, economic integration with the Mediterranean world, and uneven cultural change. In 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius ordered an invasion that placed Britain within the Roman imperial system. The motive combined military, political, and economic aims. For Rome, Britain offered resources, metals, particularly tin and lead, trade opportunities, and the prestige associated with successful conquest. The invasion force established provincial control by a combination of pitched battle, sieges, negotiated submission, and the creation of client relationships with local rulers. Military action concentrated first in the southeast and extended inland. Roman forces took existing tribal centers and converted them into administrative and military hubs. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, served as an early Roman capital. Its colonia marked the settlement of veterans and the imposition of Roman civic structures. Londinium, modern London, developed rapidly as a commercial and administrative center on the Thames. By the end of the 1st century, it functioned as the principal port for continental trade and as a hub for transport inland. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, Glevum, modern Gloucester, and other towns acquired forums, basilicas, bath complexes, and defensive circuits as Roman urban planning reshaped settlement patterns. The Roman state deployed a standing military presence to secure conquest and maintain order. Though precise legionary dispositions varied over time, by the 2nd century Britain commonly hosted several legions together with numerous auxiliary units. These forces garrisoned legionary fortresses, smaller forts, and a network of watchtowers and roads. The military also undertook major engineering projects. The construction of a durable road network linking towns and forts, the backbone for troop movement, trade, and administration, along with bridges, forts, and ports. Roman roads such as Waddling Street and Ermine Street formed durable corridors that influenced settlement and commerce for centuries thereafter. Northern limits to Roman control were established through a combination of occupation and frontier engineering. In 122 AD, the Emperor Hadrian ordered a continuous frontier barrier, completed at roughly 73 miles, 117 kilometers, and known as Hadrian's Wall, spanning from the River Tyne to the Solway Firth. The wall, with its forts, mile castles, and garrison units, defined the practical border of direct Roman administration in the north. For a short period in the mid-2nd century, the empire pressed further north with the Antonine Wall across central Scotland, but this frontier was later abandoned and the earlier Hadrianic line reoccupied. These frontier arrangements were not mere stoneworks. They structured imperial defense, policing, taxation, and interaction with neighboring peoples. Roman rule brought material and organizational innovations to British society. Roman law, municipal institutions, tax systems, and coinage integrated Britain into the imperial economy. Coin finds indicate substantial circulation of denarii and later denominations. Over time, coinage debasement in the 3rd century and 4th century monetary reforms altered local economic practice, but the presence of Roman money enabled market exchange tax payments and wider commercial links. Villas, estate centers of agricultural production, spread especially in the south and east. These complexes, sometimes extensive and richly appointed, mosaic floors, hypocaust heating, indicate agricultural surplus, specialized production, and a landowning class tied to imperial structures. Agricultural output included cereal cultivation, pastoral husbandry, and specialized industries such as pottery manufacturing, salt working, and fish salting for export. Metalworking remained important. Lead, tin, and iron extraction and processing supplied local needs and imperial demands. Urbanization under Rome concentrated population and services. Romano-British towns staffed magistrates and councils, maintained public baths and temples, and promoted commercial activities. Public architecture and inscriptions testify to civic life and local elites who adopted Roman titles and practices. Local elites frequently cooperated with Rome. Some were enrolled in Roman military or civic ranks, and others received Roman honors, facilitating governance by incorporation rather than wholesale displacement. The speed and degree of Romanization were uneven. The southeast and riverine corridor along the Thames and East Anglia show higher levels of Roman-style architecture, Latin language use, and economic diversification. Western uplands, much of Wales and northern Britain, retained more indigenous settlement forms and social patterns. Resistance to Roman domination occurred at intervals and could be severe. The most famous episode is the uprising led by the Iceni Queen Boudica around 60 to 61 AD. Following disputes over land and the treatment of native elites, Boudica's coalition attacked and destroyed Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium before being defeated in battle. The revolt highlighted social tensions produced by land confiscation, the imposition of Roman taxation, and the displacement of traditional elites. Yet its suppression also demonstrated Roman military capacity and the determination of imperial authorities to maintain order. Subsequent decades saw continuing negotiation between imperial force and local accommodation. Administration of the province evolved. Initially governed as a single province under a governor with military and civil responsibilities, Britain's administrative complexity increased. By the 3rd century, the province was commonly divided into at least 2 entities, often labeled for convenience as Britannia Superior and Britannia Inferior, reflecting the imperial tendency to split large provinces for more manageable governance and to limit concentrations of military power under a single official. In the later Roman period, further administrative subdivisions and diocesan-level structures were introduced as part of broader imperial reforms. Provincial capitals and administrative centers adapted accordingly to maintain fiscal extraction, legal order, and logistical coordination. Economic and social life in Roman Britain was strongly tied to cross-channel contacts. Imported goods, wine, olive oil, fine tablewares, and glass reveal tastes connected to broader Mediterranean culture. Simultaneously, local production adapted Roman techniques. Pottery kilns produced amphorae and tablewares for local markets, and metalworking used both indigenous ores and imperial demand. Mining for lead and tin, especially in areas such as Dorset, Mendip, and Cornwall, continued to be economically significant. Ports such as Richborough, Ritupii, and Dover handled both military traffic and commerce. Markets in towns and rural villages facilitated the exchange of grain, wool, hides, and manufactured goods. Religion in Roman Britain shows pluralism and change. Traditional native cults continued alongside the cults of the imperial pantheon and numerous imported deities. Temples to Roman gods, Mithria, and syncretic cults appear in the archaeological record. Christianity arrives in archaeological and literary traces by the 3rd and 4th centuries. Christian inscriptions and objects, along with participation by British clerics at continental councils by the early 4th century, suggest an established presence of Christian communities by the later Roman period. Religious practice thus ranged from traditional ancestral rites to New Eastern and continental forms. The 3rd century introduced stresses visible across the Roman world. Military usurpations, economic strain, currency debasement, and external pressure forced policy adaptations. Britain was not insulated from these crises. A breakaway regime under the commander Carausius in the late 3rd century established independent control over parts of the Channel provinces, including Britain, for a period. Subsequently, the empire reasserted control. Coastal defenses known as Saxon shore forts were constructed in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries to counter increasing seaborne raids by Germanic groups and others. These measures illustrate changing threat profiles and the imperial response to maritime insecurity. By the 4th century, administrative reforms, continued military deployment, and local adaptations characterized the province. Yet the century also saw growing demands on imperial resources elsewhere, along the Rhine, Danube, and in the eastern provinces, making Britain increasingly peripheral to central decisions. Political crises on the continent prompted troop redeployments. Economic pressures reduced the fiscal capacity of the central state to subsidize distant frontiers. Imperial withdrawal occurred in stages, and by 410 AD, Roman authority in Britain had effectively ended. The commonly cited catalyst is the imperial need to address crises on the continent, leading to the removal of troops and administrative support. Contemporaneous correspondence, conventionally summarized as the rescript of Emperor Honorius around 410 AD, advised British cities to look to their own defense. Local elites, municipal councils, and remaining military elements assumed responsibility for security. The institutional networks of Roman rule, taxation, standing imperial garrisons, and direct administrative oversight, therefore disintegrated or were transformed into localized forms of governance. When Roman administration ended in Britain around 410 AD, the island entered a fragmented and transitional era that historians refer to as sub-Roman Britain. The withdrawal of imperial authority did not erase the structures, people, or habits developed during the previous centuries. Many towns remained inhabited, Roman-style villas were still occupied or repurposed, and the local elite, often educated in Latin and accustomed to Roman governance, attempted to maintain civic order. However, without imperial troops and financial support, the system deteriorated. Local councils and warlords replaced provincial governors. Coinage ceased to be minted, trade networks with Gaul collapsed, and urban decline accelerated as people shifted to rural survival. Contemporary sources are scarce. Gildas, writing in the early 6th century AD, provides one of the few native accounts. He describes civil disorder, invasions, famine, and moral decay. Archaeology supports evidence of social contraction. Many towns shrank or were abandoned, while rural settlements persisted in modified forms. In western and northern Britain, especially in Wales, Cornwall, Cumbria, and parts of Scotland, continuity of local Romano-British culture was stronger. These regions retained elements of Latin Christian traditions and maintained small-scale kingdoms led by local rulers who claimed descent from Roman or tribal lineages. The power vacuum left by Rome exposed Britain to external incursions. Northern tribes such as the Picts crossed Hadrian's Wall, while Irish raiders, referred to as Scoti, attacked western coasts. In response, some British leaders hired Germanic mercenaries to defend their territories, a practice consistent with the late Roman custom of employing foederati. According to later traditions, including those recorded by Bede in the early 8th century, AD groups of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes from regions corresponding to modern Denmark, northern Germany, and the Netherlands were invited to settle and serve as defenders. Over time, these groups expanded their settlements and transformed from hired allies into independent rulers. The migration and settlement process occurred gradually between the 5th and 6th centuries AD. Archaeological evidence shows Germanic communities established along the eastern and southern coasts, from Kent and Sussex northwards through East Anglia and Lincolnshire. Distinctive burial practices, cremation cemeteries, furnished graves with weapons and jewelry, and continental-style pottery mark their presence. The linguistic shift from Latin and Celtic dialects to early Old English began in these regions, eventually forming the foundation of the English language. Population movement was not necessarily one of mass invasion, but a cumulative settlement process involving warriors, families, and gradual cultural dominance. By the 6th century AD, Britain was divided between Anglo-Saxon-controlled territories in the east and south and Romano-British or Celtic-speaking kingdoms in the west and north. The surviving British polities included Dumnonia in the southwest, Gwynedd and Powys in Wales, Strathclyde in the northwest, and smaller kingdoms in Cumbria and the borders. These societies preserved oral traditions and Christian practice derived from the late Roman Church. Monastic centers such as Bangor's Coed and later St. David played roles in maintaining learning and ecclesiastical authority. The Christian heritage of these areas would later influence missionary work to the Anglo-Saxons. Anglo-Saxon England coalesced into multiple kingdoms commonly known as the Heptarchy, a term describing 7 major polities rather than a formal alliance. These were Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Their boundaries shifted over time, with smaller kingdoms absorbed or reorganized through conquest and alliance. Each kingdom had a king, a warrior aristocracy, and assemblies, witan, advising the ruler. Governance centered on kinship, military strength, and land control rather than inherited bureaucratic institutions. Kent, among the earliest Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, emerged under rulers such as Ethelbert in the late 6th century AD. Kent's proximity to the continent facilitated contact with Frankish Gaul, leading to early Christian influence. Northumbria, formed from the unification of Bernicia and Dara in the early 7th century AD, developed into a powerful northern realm. Mercia in the Midlands expanded under leaders like Pinda and later Offa, asserting dominance over southern and eastern territories. Wessex, initially a western kingdom, would later rise to prominence under rulers such as Cadwalla and Ione. The introduction and spread of Christianity marked one of the most significant cultural transformations of the Anglo-Saxon period. 2 missionary traditions converged, one from Rome and one from Celtic Britain and Ireland. In 597 AD, Pope Gregory I sent a mission led by Augustine to Kent. King Ethelbert, whose wife Bertha was a Christian Frankish princess, permitted Augustine to preach and granted land at Canterbury, where the first English bishopric was established. This Roman mission extended through southern England, while in the north, Irish and Scottish monks, notably from the monastery of Iona, founded by Columba, spread Christianity through Northumbria and beyond. The Synod of Whitby in 664 AD resolved differences between the Celtic and Roman practices of Christianity, aligning the English Church with Roman customs and the wider Latin Church. The Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons introduced literacy through Latin, standardized ecclesiastical organization, and connection to continental intellectual traditions. Monasteries became centers of learning, art, and record-keeping. Notable institutions such as Jarrow and Wearmouth in Northumbria produced works like the Lindisfarne Gospels and fostered scholarship represented by Bede, whose ecclesiastical history of the English people, written around 731 AD, remains a central source for this period. Monks preserved both religious texts and early vernacular poetry. The production of illuminated manuscripts and the establishment of schools indicated integration into the Christian and European cultural network. Economic life during this period revolved around agriculture. Settlements were small, organized around extended families and local communities. Fields were worked collectively under open field systems, with cereal cultivation supplemented by livestock. Coastal and riverine trade revived gradually, connecting England with the Frankish kingdoms, Scandinavia, and the Mediterranean. Imports such as glass, wine, and metal goods indicate the persistence of long-distance commerce. Coinage reappeared in the late 7th century AD in the form of silver ciatus, marking renewed economic complexity. The revival of urban centers began with trading settlements known as emporia, such as Hamwick, near modern Southampton, London, Londonwick, and Ipswich, which linked inland producers with continental markets. Social hierarchy in Anglo-Saxon England was defined by rank and landholding. At the top stood the king, followed by noble retainers, thanes, free landowners, ceorls, and dependent or enslaved laborers. The Guild system, a legal compensation scale, measured a person's value according to rank, codified in law codes such as those of Ethelbert of Kent and Ione of Wessex. Law was personal and customary, enforced through local assemblies and oaths rather than centralized bureaucracies. Kinship obligations governed justice, vengeance, and protection. These structures created local stability and preserved order in the absence of a strong central government. Conflict among kingdoms shaped the political map. In the 7th and 8th centuries AD, hegemony passed successively among powerful rulers. Northumbria, under kings Edwin and Oswald, dominated much of England until defeat by Mercia. Mercian supremacy peaked under King Offa, r. 757 to 796 AD, who constructed Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork demarcating the boundary with Welsh territories. Offa maintained diplomatic relations with Charlemagne, issued a standardized coinage, and strengthened royal authority. Despite regional rivalries, the kingdoms shared cultural ties through language, religion, and law, gradually knitting together the foundations of an English identity. Relations with neighboring Celtic kingdoms were complex, involving both warfare and diplomacy. Brittonic rulers such as those in Gwynedd and Strathclyde resisted Anglo-Saxon expansion. Epic traditions, preserved in Welsh literature, celebrate these conflicts. Place names, archaeological remains, and inscriptions reflect zones of interaction and cultural exchange rather than absolute separation. Christianity provided occasional channels of contact, though linguistic and political divisions deepened. By the 8th century AD, Anglo-Saxon England was increasingly stable and prosperous. Monastic wealth expanded, literacy flourished, and ties with the Frankish and papal courts strengthened. Art and craftsmanship reached sophisticated levels, visible in metalwork such as the Sutton Hoo treasures and the Staffordshire hoard, which demonstrate both native skill and continental influence. Architectural development led to the construction of stone churches and monastic complexes, signaling the consolidation of ecclesiastical wealth and organization. In this environment of growing wealth and contact, external threats re-emerged. The first recorded Viking attack on British soil occurred at Lindisfarne in 793 AD, an event that shocked contemporaries and marked the beginning of a new phase of external pressure. The attack targeted one of the most important religious centers in Northumbria, symbolizing both the vulnerability of coastal monasteries and the increasing reach of Scandinavian seafaring groups. Though initially limited to raiding, these incursions would escalate in the following century into settlement and conquest, reshaping Britain once again. The period between 793 and 1066 AD in England is characterized by sustained Norse activity, the gradual consolidation of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the emergence of a unified English polity. This era, known broadly as the Viking Age in British history, begins with documented Viking raids and culminates in the centralization of England under a single crown before the Norman Conquest. The first recorded Viking attack occurred in 793 AD at the monastery of Lindisfarne on the northeast coast of Northumbria. This monastery, established in 635 AD by Irish missionary monks, had become a center of learning, manuscript production, and religious influence. The attack was significant both for its immediacy and for its symbolism. The destruction of a religious center underscored the vulnerability of isolated coastal settlements and the reach of Scandinavian seafarers. Archaeological evidence and subsequent records indicate that the initial raids were targeted, highly mobile, and opportunistic, involving small fleets of longships. The Norse attackers sought plunder, particularly precious metals, liturgical items, and livestock, but their activities expanded over the following decades to larger-scale expeditions and eventual settlement. During the 9th century, Viking activity in England intensified. The Danish Vikings, often referred to collectively as Danes in contemporary sources, conducted repeated incursions along eastern and northern coastlines, exploiting the fragmented political landscape of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were especially affected. Northumbria, already weakened by internal factionalism, experienced a succession of raids that destabilized both the royal court and ecclesiastical centers. York, known as Eoforwic to the Anglo-Saxons and later as Jorvik to the Danes, fell under Norse control by 866 AD, becoming a major center of Danish administration, trade, and settlement in northern England. Archaeological evidence in York, including urban restructuring and imported Scandinavian artifacts, indicates that Norse governance was not only military but also economic and social, establishing lasting influence over local populations. The Viking incursions were not confined to raiding. Settlement and political integration became increasingly common. In the mid-9th century, large portions of eastern and northern England came under Danish control, collectively known as the Danelaw. This term, used in contemporary legal texts, refers to areas where Danish law predominated over Anglo-Saxon customary law. The Danelaw encompassed much of modern-day Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and East Anglia, extending as far south as the Thames in some interpretations. Within the Danelaw, Danish rulers established administrative centers, redistributed land, and introduced Scandinavian legal practices, particularly concerning inheritance, compensation, and dispute resolution. Evidence from place names, such as those ending in by, farmstead or village, and thorp, secondary settlement, demonstrates extensive Norse settlement and integration into the local economy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms responded with a combination of military resistance, diplomacy, and strategic fortification. Wessex, under the leadership of King Alfred the Great, r. 871 to 899 AD, emerged as the most effective defender of Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred inherited a kingdom threatened by repeated Danish invasions and a demoralized population. He undertook extensive reforms in military organization, law, and education. Military measures included the construction of fortified towns known as Buzz, strategically placed to defend against Viking raids and to serve as centers of local administration. Alfred also restructured the FYRD, a system of local militia, ensuring that troops could respond rapidly to Viking movements. In addition to military measures, Alfred focused on cultural and legal consolidation. He sponsored translations of Latin texts into Old English, promoting literacy and administrative competency among his officials. Legal codes were revised, combining customary law with moral and ecclesiastical guidance. These reforms strengthened both the cohesion of Wessex and its capacity to project power against Danish forces. By the late 9th century, Alfred had successfully defended southern England and negotiated treaties with Danish leaders, such as Guthrum, resulting in the division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Danish-controlled territories. The Treaty of Wedmore, c. 878 AD, formalized this arrangement, recognizing Guthrum's authority in East Anglia and requiring his conversion to Christianity. Following Alfred, his successors expanded Wessex's influence and gradually reconquered Danish territories. Edward the Elder, r. 899 to 924 AD, and Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, systematically subdued the Danelaw through military campaigns and the establishment of additional fortified towns. This process, which involved coordinated Anglo-Saxon and Mercian resistance, gradually reduced Danish power in the Midlands and eastern England. The Reconquest was administrative as well as military. Anglo-Saxon rulers implemented systems of governance, taxation, and local courts in recovered territories, integrating them into the emerging English state. By the early 10th century, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, r. 924 to 939 AD, achieved a level of political unification unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon history. Athelstan extended authority over Northumbria, effectively bringing all Anglo-Saxon and reconquered Danish territories under a single ruler. Contemporary charters and chronicles emphasize his recognition by continental powers and internal elites, indicating the establishment of a legitimate monarchy with centralized authority. Athelstan also promoted uniform laws across his realm, standardizing legal practice and consolidating administrative structures. This unification laid the foundation for England as a coherent political entity, even as local lordships and regional identities persisted. Norse influence continued in northern and eastern regions despite the Anglo-Saxon reconquest. The integration of Scandinavian settlers into local communities had lasting cultural, linguistic, and economic effects. Many place names, agricultural practices, and artisanal techniques in eastern England reflect Scandinavian origins. Maritime trade, shipbuilding, and coastal defense strategies in subsequent centuries were influenced by Norse experience and technology. Christianization efforts continued, with monasteries in Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia serving as centers of learning and record-keeping, often blending Anglo-Saxon and Norse elements in art, architecture, and liturgical practice. The 10th and early 11th centuries witnessed intermittent Viking invasions under leaders such as Sweyn Forkbeard and Knut the Great, culminating in periods of Danish rule over England from 1013 to 1042 AD. Knut's reign, 1016 to 1035 AD, was marked by the consolidation of Anglo-Scandinavian governance, a centralized system of taxation, and the establishment of royal law codes that blended Danish and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Administrative continuity from previous Anglo-Saxon governance facilitated the integration of Danish rule, maintaining stability in urban and rural areas while reinforcing monarchical authority. After Knut's death, the English monarchy returned to native rulers, restoring Anglo-Saxon leadership under Edward the Confessor. Throughout this period, society remained hierarchical. Kings, earls, thanes, and local officials exercised authority through kinship ties and land tenure. The Witan, an assembly of nobles and clergy, advised the king, influencing succession, legislation, and military decisions. Agrarian production sustained the population, supplemented by trade in wool, metals, and imported goods. Coinage reemerged as a medium of taxation and trade, reflecting the increasing sophistication of economic systems. Urban centers such as York, London, and Winchester served as administrative and commercial hubs, connecting England to continental Europe. Religious institutions continued to shape cultural and intellectual life. Monasteries preserved Latin literacy and produced historical records, including charters, hagiographies, and chronicles. They also functioned as centers of education, art, and manuscript production. The Church played a central role in mediating political authority, providing ideological legitimacy for kings, and facilitating integration of previously distinct regional identities. Christian networks extended to continental Europe, fostering the exchange of ideas, texts, and clerical personnel. The Viking Age also brought technological and economic exchange. Scandinavian influence is evident in shipbuilding techniques, which enhanced coastal mobility, and in the development of fortified settlements suitable for defense and trade. The integration of Scandinavian artisans and traders contributed to urban growth, metalwork, and coinage standardization. The cultural blending of Anglo-Saxon and Norse populations produced a hybrid identity in regions formerly under Danish control, influencing language, legal practice, and social organization. By the mid-11th century, England had achieved a degree of political centralization and cultural integration not seen in previous centuries. The kingdoms of the Heptarchy had consolidated into a unified monarchy, incorporating former Danelaw territories under standardized administration, law, and taxation. Anglo-Saxon governance, reinforced by Christian institutions and influenced by Scandinavian settlers, provided continuity and resilience. Nevertheless, external threats persisted. Political alliances, succession disputes, and residual Scandinavian ambitions ensured that military readiness remained essential. The accumulation of administrative experience, legal codification, and urban development during the Viking Age created the foundation for England that would face the Norman Conquest in 1066 AD. The history of England from 1066 to 1485 AD is defined by the conquest of the Norman dynasty, the establishment of a centralized monarchy, the consolidation of feudal governance, and the development of England as a kingdom capable of projecting power both domestically and abroad. This period begins with the Norman Conquest, continues through the Plantagenet dynasty, and encompasses wars, legal reforms, dynastic struggles, and the emergence of parliamentary institutions. In 1066 AD, William, Duke of Normandy, claimed the English throne following the death of Edward the Confessor. Edward's death created a contested succession between Harold Godwin's son, the Wittance-elected king, and William, who asserted a claim through alleged prior promises and kinship ties. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066 AD. Harold's forces were defeated, and he was killed in battle. William's victory was not only military but also political, as it established Norman authority over an Anglo-Saxon population resistant to foreign rule. Following his victory, William faced the challenge of consolidating control over England. He implemented a feudal system, distributing land to Norman nobles loyal to him, while retaining ultimate ownership as the sovereign. This redistribution reshaped the social hierarchy, displacing many Anglo-Saxon elites. Castles were constructed across the kingdom to enforce Norman control, including motte and bailey fortifications in key towns and strategic locations such as Dover, Nottingham, and Windsor. These fortifications served both defensive and administrative functions, symbolizing Norman authority and enabling military enforcement of royal rule. Administrative restructuring was reinforced by detailed surveys, most notably the Domesday Book of 1086 AD. This record cataloged landholdings, resources, and taxable wealth throughout England, providing the crown with precise information for taxation and governance. The Domesday Book also illustrates the persistence of Anglo-Saxon land management practices while simultaneously demonstrating the imposition of Norman oversight. The survey facilitated royal control, enabling the effective collection of rents, fines, and services owed by tenants-in-chief and their subordinate lords. Norman governance extended to legal and ecclesiastical systems. William reorganized the English Church, replacing Anglo-Saxon bishops with Norman clergy, thereby aligning the ecclesiastical hierarchy with the crown. The Church remained a central institution for social, educational, and administrative functions. Canon law influenced royal policy, and church courts adjudicated matters ranging from moral offenses to disputes over land and inheritance. Latin was the primary language of administration, liturgy, and law, while Anglo-Norman French became the language of the ruling elite, contributing to a bilingual and bicultural society that persisted for several generations. The 12th century saw the consolidation of Norman power under the House of Anjou, later known as the Plantagenets. Henry II, ascending to the throne in 1154 AD, inherited not only England but also extensive territories in France, including Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine through marriage. This created the Angevin Empire, which tied English interests closely to continental politics. Henry II enacted legal reforms that strengthened royal authority, including the development of common law and the establishment of itinerant royal justices. These reforms standardized legal practice, curtailed baronial independence, and created a system in which the king's courts could adjudicate disputes previously handled by local or feudal authorities. Henry II's conflict with the Church illustrates the balance of power between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Disputes over the jurisdiction of royal courts versus church courts culminated in the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170 AD. The incident provoked public outrage, but ultimately led to compromise. The crown maintained influence over the legal system while respecting ecclesiastical prerogatives. The relationship between monarchy and church continued to evolve, with successive rulers negotiating authority over appointments, taxation, and administration. Under the Plantagenets, England experienced sustained military engagement abroad, most notably the Hundred Years' War against France, 1337 to 1453 AD. This conflict arose from competing claims to the French throne and continental territories. Early English successes under Edward III and the Black Prince included victories at Crécy, 1346 AD, and Poitiers, 1356 AD, demonstrating the effectiveness of longbowmen, disciplined infantry, and tactical innovation. The war facilitated the rise of a professional soldiery, advances in military technology, and the development of taxation systems to support prolonged campaigns. Control over French territories fluctuated over time, but England's participation in these wars reinforced its identity as a kingdom with continental influence and a centralized administrative apparatus capable of mobilizing resources for military objectives. Domestically, England experienced periodic social unrest. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 AD was triggered by economic hardship, taxation, and the aftermath of the Black Death. Labor shortages increased peasants' bargaining power, and successive poll taxes led to widespread rebellion. Although the revolt was suppressed, it revealed structural tensions within feudal society and influenced future legal and economic policies regarding labor obligations and land tenure. Nobility, clergy, and monarchy increasingly recognized the need to manage economic pressures and the social expectations of free and dependent populations. Dynastic instability also marked Plantagenet England. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485 AD, a series of civil conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, arose from disputed succession, baronial rivalry, and political factionalism. The conflict culminated in the defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 AD by Henry Tudor, establishing the Tudor dynasty. These wars highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in feudal succession and the consequences of protracted aristocratic competition. They also underscored the transition from localized military authority to a more centralized monarchy capable of asserting ultimate sovereignty over competing noble factions. Economic development continued alongside political and military events. Agricultural productivity expanded through innovations in crop rotation, animal husbandry, and the consolidation of land holdings. Trade networks extended both domestically and internationally, connecting English ports such as London, Bristol, and Hull to markets in Flanders, the Hanseatic League, and the Mediterranean. Urban centers grew, facilitating the development of guilds, craft specialization, and market regulation. Coinage, particularly silver pennies, became standardized under royal control, enabling more effective taxation, commerce, and economic monitoring. Legal and administrative systems evolved under Plantagenet governance. Statutory law, common law, and precedent became increasingly formalized. Kings issued writs to summon individuals, collect taxes, or enforce judgments, laying the foundation for modern bureaucratic procedures. Parliaments, initially advisory gatherings of nobles and clergy, gradually assumed legislative and fiscal responsibilities, negotiating taxation and governance with the crown. This development reflected a balance between monarchical authority and emerging institutional representation, influencing subsequent English constitutional practice. Cultural and intellectual life flourished despite the turbulence of warfare and political strife. Monastic centers remained key repositories of knowledge, producing illuminated manuscripts, chronicles, and religious texts. Education extended to cathedral schools, where Latin literacy enabled clerical administration and legal documentation. Architectural achievement is evident in Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals, including Durham, Canterbury, and Westminster Abbey, reflecting technological advancement, continental influence, and religious patronage. Artistic production, including metalwork, textiles, and manuscript illumination, demonstrated the interconnection of local skill and European exchange. Population and settlement patterns evolved. Rural communities continued agricultural production, while urban growth facilitated markets, trade, and the emergence of merchant classes. Anglo-Norman culture merged with residual Anglo-Saxon traditions, producing a hybrid social and linguistic environment. Place names, legal terminology, and cultural practices reveal the integration of Norman and native influences over successive generations. Scandinavian influence persisted in regions previously under Danish control, particularly in the north and east, demonstrating continuity from earlier Viking settlements. By the late 15th century, England had transitioned from a collection of feudal territories into a centralized monarchy with administrative sophistication, legal standardization, and economic integration. The Norman and Plantagenet periods established structures of governance, law, and military organization that persisted into the Tudor era. Royal authority was exercised through a combination of land control, taxation, legal codification, and bureaucratic oversight, while urban centers and trade networks reinforced national cohesion. The period also set the stage for England's emerging role in European diplomacy, warfare, and continental politics, preparing the kingdom for subsequent developments under the Tudor dynasty. The period of Tudor Britain, from 1485 to 1603 AD, represents a transformation of England from a kingdom recovering from civil conflict to a centralized state with increasing international influence. It began with the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, following the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses, and concluded with the death of Elizabeth I, which left the throne to the House of Stuart. The Tudor era is characterized by the consolidation of monarchical power, religious reformation, administrative reform, economic change, and overseas exploration. In 1485 AD, Henry Tudor, a claimant from the Lancastrian line, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, effectively ending the dynastic struggle known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry assumed the throne as Henry VII, establishing the Tudor dynasty and initiating policies to stabilize a kingdom fractured by decades of civil war. The consolidation of power involved curbing the influence of magnates through financial oversight, monitoring private armies, and strengthening the administrative apparatus of the monarchy. Henry VII relied on tools such as the Court of Star Chamber to enforce justice and reduce lawlessness among the nobility. This legal body exercised authority directly on behalf of the crown, providing a mechanism to control disputes and limit feudal autonomy. Henry VII pursued financial reform to secure the monarchy's resources. The exchequer system was reorganized to ensure the reliable collection of revenue from taxes, customs, and feudal dues. Bonds and recognizances became common instruments to enforce loyalty from the nobility. Land disputes were carefully monitored and escheat. Reversion of land to the crown in cases of death without heirs or forfeiture was applied strategically. These measures allowed the Tudor monarchy to maintain a degree of financial independence from parliamentary grants, a critical factor in ensuring stability following the Wars of the Roses. The reign of Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547 AD, Henry VII's son, further transformed England politically, religiously, and culturally. Initially, Henry VIII continued the administrative and fiscal policies of his father, maintaining centralized control over governance and law. The early years of his reign were marked by the consolidation of royal authority, the enforcement of justice, and the patronage of culture. Henry VIII expanded the Royal Navy and reinforced coastal defenses, establishing a permanent maritime force that would later underpin England's naval capacity. Religious transformation was central to Henry VIII's reign. The king's desire for a male heir and his subsequent marriage annulment requests to Catherine of Aragon led to conflict with the papacy. By 1534 AD, through the Act of Supremacy, Henry established himself as the supreme head of the Church of England, formally breaking from the Roman Catholic Church. This reformation extended royal authority into ecclesiastical governance, allowing the crown to control appointments, revenues, and doctrinal matters. Monasteries were dissolved systematically between 1536 and 1541 AD, and their lands and wealth were appropriated by the crown or sold to loyal nobles. The redistribution of monastic land altered the social and economic landscape, expanding the landed gentry and reinforcing the power of the monarchy. Henry VIII's religious reforms introduced a period of doctrinal fluidity. The English Bible was authorized in 1539 AD, making scripture accessible in English and standardizing religious practice in alignment with royal authority. While the king maintained conservative theological positions, the dissolution of monasteries and reallocation of church property had long-term consequences for education, social welfare, and local economies. Schools previously associated with monastic institutions were reconstituted, often under secular or church oversight, laying foundations for increased literacy and administrative competence. Following Henry VIII, his son Edward VI, 1547 to 1553 AD, implemented Protestant reforms more rigorously. Under the guidance of regents and advisors such as the Duke of Somerset and Archbishop Cranmer, liturgical practice shifted towards the use of the Book of Common Prayer, 1549 AD, vernacular worship, and simplified sacraments. English law increasingly reflected Protestant theology, and measures were taken to suppress traditional Catholic practices. Edward VI's short reign was characterized by centralization of authority, administrative reform, and enforcement of Protestant orthodoxy. The ascension of Mary I, 1553 to 1558 AD, marked a reversal in religious policy. Mary, a devout Catholic, restored papal authority and attempted to reinstate Roman Catholicism as the national religion. Her reign saw the persecution of Protestant clergy and laity, with the execution of notable reformers such as Thomas Cranmer. Mary's marriage to Philip II of Spain was a strategic alliance, aligning England with Habsburg interests on the continent, but provoking domestic opposition due to fears of foreign influence. Religious oscillation during this period caused significant tension among the population, though administrative continuity and legal structures remained intact. Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603 AD, succeeded Mary I, establishing a stable and enduring form of governance that balanced religious and political concerns. The Elizabethan religious settlement of 1559 AD reasserted the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, combining Protestant theology with traditional ceremonial elements acceptable to a wide range of subjects. Acts of uniformity and supremacy established the structure of the Anglican Church, providing legal authority for worship, clerical hierarchy, and royal oversight. The settlement allowed England to maintain internal stability while avoiding the extremes of continental sectarian conflict. Elizabeth I's reign was marked by cultural and intellectual expansion, often referred to as the Elizabethan Renaissance. Educational institutions, including grammar schools and universities such as Oxford and Cambridge, flourished. Literature, theater, and scholarly production increased, with figures such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser contributing to the development of the English language and culture. Patronage of the arts by the monarchy and the nobility fostered a vibrant cultural environment, promoting literacy, artistic skill, and historical documentation. Maritime expansion and naval development were crucial during the Elizabethan period. England's naval forces were strengthened to confront external threats, most notably the Spanish Armada of 1588 AD. The defeat of the Armada solidified England's maritime capabilities, established a foundation for overseas exploration, and reinforced the authority of the Tudor monarchy. Privateering and trading expeditions increased contact with Africa, the Americas, and Asia, contributing to economic growth and the accumulation of knowledge regarding global geography and commerce. Economic change during the Tudor period involved the expansion of commerce, agrarian productivity, and urban development. The enclosure movement reorganized land for more efficient agricultural production, although it displaced smallholders and reshaped rural communities. Wool and cloth production became central to trade, with exports connecting England to continental markets. London emerged as a primary commercial and administrative center, its population growing substantially as domestic and international trade increased. Markets, fairs, and early banking practices facilitated economic integration, while taxation and customs duties provided the crown with financial resources to fund governance and military operations. Legal and administrative reform was a continuing feature of the Tudor period. The monarchy strengthened royal courts, codified statutes, and enhanced bureaucratic structures to enforce royal authority across the kingdom. The Court of Star Chamber continued under Henry VIII and subsequent monarchs, exercising judicial authority to maintain order and suppress aristocratic resistance. Centralized oversight of taxation, law, and governance reduced the autonomy of local lords, increasing the capacity of the crown to implement policy consistently throughout England. Population growth and urbanization increased during the 16th century, accompanied by the development of towns such as London, Bristol, and Norwich as centers of trade, craft, and governance. Guilds and merchant associations regulated professional standards, production quality, and commerce. Urban infrastructure expanded, including market facilities, ports, and civic buildings. Economic activity linked rural and urban populations, contributing to social stability and the emergence of a more complex society capable of sustaining administrative, military, and cultural development. By the end of Elizabeth I's reign in 1603 AD, England had transformed politically, religiously, and economically. The monarchy had centralized authority, balanced religious settlement with political stability, and established administrative, legal, and economic frameworks that would endure into the Stuart period. The crown exercised control over finance, law, and church institutions, while maritime and commercial expansion laid the foundations for England's emergence as a global power. Culturally, the period produced a lasting legacy of literature, scholarship, and intellectual achievement. England's population had grown and urbanized, its economy diversified, and its political and religious structures consolidated, establishing the framework for early modern Britain and the challenges of the following century. The period of Stuart Britain, from 1603 to 1714 AD, encompasses the union of the English and Scottish crowns, religious and political tensions, civil war, the temporary abolition of the monarchy, the restoration of the crown, and the eventual establishment of a constitutional monarchy. This era saw the consolidation of parliamentary institutions, the negotiation of royal authority, and the emergence of England and Scotland as politically interconnected kingdoms, laying the foundations for the formation of Great Britain. In 1603 AD, the Tudor dynasty ended with the death of Elizabeth I. She left no direct heir, and the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns. This accession was significant as it brought two historically distinct kingdoms under one monarch, although each retained its own parliament, legal system, and administrative structures. James sought to unify governance, promote religious conformity, and establish the principle of divine right monarchy, asserting that the king's authority was sanctioned directly by God. His reign, 1603 to 1625 AD, faced immediate challenges, including the reconciliation of differing religious practices, fiscal pressures, and political expectations from the English Parliament. Religious tensions were central to Stuart governance. England remained predominantly Protestant following the Elizabethan settlement, but Catholic minorities persisted. James I attempted to impose limited tolerance for Catholics while enforcing conformity to the Church of England. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 AD, a failed conspiracy by Catholic extremists to assassinate the king and destroy Parliament, heightened suspicion of Catholics and resulted in stricter enforcement of anti-Catholic legislation. James also contended with Puritan reformers, who sought further simplification of worship and ecclesiastical practices, creating pressure on royal authority to manage religious factions without provoking rebellion. James I promoted legal and administrative standardization. He authorized the translation of the Bible into English, producing the King James Version, 1611 AD, which standardized scripture for Anglican worship and had long-lasting cultural and linguistic impact. Governance relied on royal prerogative, but increasing demands from Parliament for taxation, legislative consultation, and oversight challenged the monarchy's authority. Financial strain from maintaining court expenses, funding colonial ventures, and managing national defense amplified tensions between the crown and representative institutions. James I was succeeded by Charles I in 1625 AD, whose reign intensified conflicts between the monarchy and Parliament. Charles inherited unresolved issues concerning taxation, fiscal policy, and religious policy. Disputes over royal prerogative and parliamentary rights, particularly regarding subsidies and taxation, culminated in repeated confrontations. Charles's support for high Anglican practices, perceived as sympathetic to Catholicism, provoked opposition from Puritans and other Protestant factions, heightening political polarization. Fiscal pressure led Charles I to impose forced loans, ship money, and other non-parliamentary revenue measures, which were challenged in the courts. Legal precedents, such as the 1637 case of ship money, tested the limits of royal authority and parliamentary consent. Resistance to fiscal measures, combined with religious dissent and the king's authoritarian tendencies, contributed to the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642 AD. The civil conflict divided the kingdom into factions aligned with the monarchy, parliament, and regional loyalties. Royalists, Cavaliers, supported the king, while parliamentarians, Roundheads, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell, sought to curtail royal authority and reform governance. The war was fought in multiple theaters, including southern and northern England, with sieges, pitched battles, and regional uprisings. Key engagements included the Battle of Edgehill, 1642 AD, Marston Moor, 1644 AD, and Naseby, 1645 AD, in which parliamentarian forces increasingly employed disciplined infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The parliamentarians gradually gained military advantage through the formation of the New Model Army in 1645 AD, a professional and centralized force emphasizing merit, discipline, and religious motivation aligned with Puritan ideals. The army's effectiveness facilitated the defeat of royalist forces, the capture of Charles I, and the eventual trial of the king. In 1649 AD, Charles I was executed for high treason, a historically unprecedented act demonstrating the assertion of parliamentary sovereignty over royal prerogative. Following the king's execution, England was declared a commonwealth and subsequently a protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1653 to 1658 AD. The monarchy and House of Lords were abolished, and executive authority rested with the Lord Protector and a reformed parliamentary structure. Cromwell pursued domestic stability through administrative reform, fiscal management, and suppression of royalist insurrections. Religious policy favored Protestant sects aligned with Puritan ideals while limiting the influence of Catholics and Episcopalians. Governance extended to Ireland and Scotland, where military campaigns and occupation consolidated English authority. The Commonwealth period also engaged in overseas policy, including naval operations and colonial administration. England strengthened maritime trade, expanded influence in the Caribbean and North America, and contested Spanish and Dutch commercial interests. Administrative centralization during the Protectorate laid the groundwork for subsequent governmental systems, including the professionalization of civil service, fiscal oversight, and coordination of military and naval forces. Following Cromwell's death in 1658, political instability led to the collapse of the Protectorate. In 1660 AD, the monarchy was restored with Charles II, initiating the period known as the Restoration. Charles II, 1660 to 1685 AD, balanced royal authority with parliamentary consultation, restored the Church of England, and negotiated legal frameworks to re-establish stability. His reign addressed the challenges left by the civil wars, including property restitution, financial reform, and reconciliation of former royalists and parliamentarians. Charles II's administration also encouraged cultural revival, scientific inquiry, and urban development, exemplified by the founding of the Royal Society in 1660 AD. Religious and political tension persisted under Charles II and his successor James II, 1685 to 1688 AD. James's open Catholicism and attempts to relax restrictions on Catholics provoked fears of absolutism and foreign influence. In 1688 AD, the Glorious Revolution occurred when James was deposed, and William III and Mary II were invited to assume the throne jointly. The revolution affirmed parliamentary supremacy over the monarchy, codified in the Bill of Rights, 1689 AD, which prohibited the monarch from suspending laws without consent, levying taxes independently, or maintaining a standing army without parliamentary approval. These provisions established a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary sovereignty as foundational principles of English governance. The formal unification of England and Scotland followed in 1707 AD with the Act of Union, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. This act merged the parliaments of the two kingdoms while preserving separate legal systems and religious establishments. The union facilitated coordinated defense, trade, and political administration across Britain, enhancing the kingdom's capacity to engage in European diplomacy and overseas expansion. Economic and political integration strengthened London's position as the center of governance, commerce, and finance. Throughout the Stuart period, economic change and demographic growth were significant. Agricultural production increased through innovations in crop rotation, drainage, and selective breeding, while domestic and international trade expanded. Urban centers grew, including London, Bristol, and Edinburgh, with trade networks connecting Britain to continental Europe, the Atlantic, and emerging colonial markets. Coinage and fiscal systems were standardized under royal oversight, supporting both domestic administration and military expenditures. Guilds, markets, and emerging commercial institutions facilitated the professionalization of urban economies and integration with regional agrarian production. Cultural and intellectual life evolved alongside political transformation. The Stuart era saw the growth of literature, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. Writers such as John Milton and Sir Thomas Browne contributed to intellectual discourse, while the Royal Society and similar institutions promoted empirical investigation and experimentation. Architecture reflected both practical governance and aesthetic ambition, with restoration of palaces, construction of civic buildings, and urban planning indicative of centralized control and social order. Population distribution and social hierarchy adapted to the transformations of governance, warfare, and the economy. The nobility remained influential but increasingly subject to royal authority and parliamentary law. Gentry, merchants, and professionals gained prominence through economic activity and service to the crown and state. Rural communities experienced pressures from enclosure, taxation, and shifting labor obligations, while urban populations adapted to commercial and administrative expansion. Social mobility, though limited, became more feasible in specialized trades, legal professions, and military service, reflecting the evolving integration of society under central authority. The period of Georgian Britain, from 1714 to 1837 AD, marks a transformation in political governance, economic expansion, industrial development, and imperial influence. It begins with the accession of George I of Hanover in 1714 AD, following the death of Queen, and in the implementation of the Act of Settlement, 1701 AD, which ensured Protestant succession. The era is characterized by the consolidation of parliamentary government, the expansion of Britain's global empire, the growth of urban centers, and the emergence of industrial and social transformation that would redefine the kingdom's internal and international role. The accession of George I, a German prince with limited English proficiency and experience, significantly shifted political power to the British Parliament. The monarch relied heavily on ministers to manage domestic affairs, leading to the development of the modern cabinet system and strengthening the office of the Prime Minister. Robert Walpole, serving from 1721 to 1742 AD, became the de facto first Prime Minister, implementing fiscal, political, and administrative policies that stabilized government, maintained peace abroad, and promoted trade and economic growth. Parliamentary supremacy over royal authority became firmly established during this period, reducing the likelihood of arbitrary rule and increasing institutional continuity. Economic development accelerated under Georgian governance. Agriculture benefited from innovations such as improved crop rotation, selective breeding of livestock, and drainage techniques, increasing productivity and sustaining population growth. Enclosure movements reorganized land holdings, consolidating small farms into larger, more efficient estates. This process displaced rural laborers but facilitated agricultural investment, mechanization, and surplus production. The resulting migration to towns and cities contributed to the growth of urban labor markets, supporting industrial expansion and creating conditions for commercial and manufacturing development. Trade and commerce flourished. Britain's domestic and international markets expanded through both overland and maritime channels. Ports such as London, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow became central hubs of import and export activity, facilitating trade in textiles, sugar, tobacco, and manufactured goods. The development of banking, insurance, and joint stock companies supported long-distance trade and colonial investment. Economic growth was reinforced by financial innovations, including the Bank of England, founded 1694 AD, which stabilized currency, provided credit for government borrowing, and enabled investment in infrastructure and trade ventures. Colonial expansion was a defining feature of the Georgian era. Britain consolidated control over territories in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and India, establishing commercial networks and political authority through a combination of trade, diplomacy, and military presence. Conflicts with France, Spain, and other European powers determined the allocation of colonial territories, most notably through the Seven Years' War, 1756 to 1763. British victories in North America, the Caribbean, and India expanded imperial reach, while treaties such as the Treaty of Paris, 1763 AD, codified territorial gains and strengthened Britain's position as a global power. Colonial administration involved a combination of local governance, appointed governors, and trade regulation, linking imperial revenue to domestic political and economic structures. Military organization and naval development were central to British power projection. The Royal Navy became the backbone of imperial security, enabling control of trade routes, protection of colonies, and deterrence of rival powers. Coastal fortifications, naval bases, and shipbuilding infrastructure supported sustained military readiness. Advances in gunnery, navigation, and logistics allowed the British to maintain operational superiority over European competitors, while disciplined infantry and professionalized officers supported overseas campaigns. The combination of naval dominance and professional land forces ensured Britain's capacity to sustain its empire and defend economic interests. Domestic politics evolved alongside economic and military expansion. Parliamentary institutions matured, with Whig and Tory factions representing divergent interests. The Whigs generally supported commercial and urban interests, parliamentary authority, and Protestant succession, while the Tories represented the landed gentry, Anglican orthodoxy, and rural constituencies. Parliamentary debates addressed taxation, trade regulation, military expenditure, and social policy. Political patronage and party organization facilitated governance, while parliamentary oversight of fiscal matters reinforced constitutional structures developed during the Stuart period. Social and demographic changes were pronounced. Population growth accelerated from approximately 6 million in 1700 AD to over 12 million by 1830 AD. Urbanization increased, with London exceeding 1 million inhabitants by the early 19th century. The growth of cities created challenges in housing, sanitation, and labor organization, but also facilitated the concentration of artisans, merchants, and industrial workers. Social stratification evolved, with a growing middle class of merchants, professionals, and industrial entrepreneurs complementing traditional aristocratic and gentry elites. Education, literacy, and access to information expanded, supported by the proliferation of newspapers, pamphlets, and schools, creating an increasingly informed and economically active population. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the mid-18th century, fundamentally altered Britain's economic and social structure. Innovations in textile production, metallurgy, and mechanized manufacturing increased productivity and output. Steam engines, water power, and mechanized looms revolutionized production in both urban and rural contexts. Industrial centers emerged in Lancashire, Yorkshire, the Midlands, and Scotland, concentrating labor, investment, and technological expertise. Infrastructure, including canals, roads, and later railways, facilitated the movement of goods, raw materials, and labor, integrating regional economies into national and international markets. Industrialization also stimulated financial services, insurance, and commercial networks, supporting sustained economic expansion. Legal and institutional development accompanied economic and social change. Property law, contract law, and commercial regulation were refined to facilitate trade, enforce agreements, and protect capital investment. Municipal governance evolved to manage growing urban populations, including the regulation of markets, public health, and local taxation. Criminal and civil law became increasingly standardized, reflecting the centralization of authority and the professionalization of judicial administration. Parliamentary legislation addressed social and economic pressures, including acts regulating labor, poor relief, and commercial standards. Scientific and cultural advancement flourished during the Georgian period. Institutions such as the Royal Society promoted empirical research in natural philosophy, mathematics, and navigation, supporting industrial and technological innovation. Literature, architecture, and art reflected neoclassical influence, with figures such as Samuel Johnson, Jane Austen, and Sir Joshua Reynolds contributing to cultural life. Urban development included planned cities, civic buildings, and cultural institutions, reflecting both aesthetic and functional priorities linked to governance, commerce, and social order. Conflicts abroad defined Britain's international role. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783 AD, challenged imperial authority, resulting in the loss of 13 colonies. The conflict highlighted the complexity of governance across distant territories, the limitations of taxation without representation, and the influence of Enlightenment ideas on governance and political rights. Britain retained other colonial holdings, including Canada, the Caribbean, and India, allowing continued economic benefit and strategic positioning. Subsequent European conflicts, including wars with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, 1793 to 1815 AD, further demonstrated the integration of military, naval, and financial resources in pursuit of national and imperial objectives. Britain's victory in the Napoleonic Wars reinforced naval dominance, secured global trade routes, and affirmed Britain's status as a preeminent European and global power. Population growth, urbanization, and industrialization prompted social reform. Efforts to address poverty, labor conditions, and public health emerged in response to industrial expansion. Charitable institutions, reformist advocacy, and early governmental intervention sought to regulate working conditions, alleviate urban poverty, and manage public services. Labor organization and social consciousness developed. laying the foundations for later movements in suffrage, labor rights, and public education. Economic integration links domestic and international spheres. Manufacturing output, agricultural production, and colonial trade created interdependence between regional economies, urban centers, and global markets. Financial institutions supported credit, investment, and insurance, enabling both industrial and commercial expansion. Tariff policy, trade regulation, and maritime protection facilitated national economic growth while reinforcing Britain's position in global commerce. Economic structures underpinned the accumulation of wealth necessary for sustaining military, administrative, and social institutions. Religious life in Georgian Britain reflected continuity and adaptation. The Church of England remained the established church, supported by tithes, landholdings, and legal privileges. Nonconformist Protestant groups, including Methodists and Baptists, expanded during the 18th century, influencing social practice, education, and charitable activity. Catholic communities persisted but remained subject to legal restrictions. Religious diversity coexisted with state regulation, contributing to social cohesion while allowing limited expression of sectarian identity. Religious institutions also facilitated literacy, schooling, and moral instruction, supporting administrative and social functions. By 1837 AD, the end of the Georgian period coincided with the death of William IV and the accession of Queen Victoria, marking the transition to the Victorian era. The period had transformed Britain into a constitutional monarchy with mature parliamentary institutions, an industrializing economy, a centralized legal system, and global imperial reach. Urbanization, technological innovation, and overseas expansion had fundamentally altered demographic, economic, and social structures. Military and naval development enabled Britain to project power globally, while political reforms, fiscal organization, and legal codification strengthened governance. Culturally and intellectually, the era laid the foundations for modern education, scientific inquiry, and literary achievement. Georgian Britain represents the consolidation of political authority, the emergence of industrial and commercial society, and the establishment of a global empire that would define Britain's position in the 19th century. The period of Victorian Britain, between 1837 and 1901, represents a transformation of the United Kingdom into a global industrial and imperial power, characterized by economic expansion, social reform, technological innovation, and territorial consolidation. The reign of Queen Victoria established institutional stability within a constitutional monarchy, strengthened the parliamentary system, and oversaw the continued growth of the British Empire. This era was defined by industrialization, urbanization, scientific advancement, and expanding influence across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 AD, following the death of William IV, at a time when the nation had already undergone significant industrial, political, and social change. The Reform Act of 1832 had broadened electoral representation, while parliamentary sovereignty had been reinforced in previous decades. Victoria's early reign coincided with the ongoing Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century and accelerated during the early 19th century. Industrialization reshaped Britain's economy, society, and geography. Manufacturing centers expanded in Lancashire, Yorkshire, the Midlands, and the industrial towns of Scotland. Textile production, iron and steel manufacturing, coal extraction, and shipbuilding became primary drivers of economic growth. Steam power, mechanized looms, and improved metallurgy transformed production, increasing output and efficiency. Urbanization accompanied industrial expansion. Population growth, which had risen from approximately 12 million in 1830 AD to over 30 million by the end of the century, concentrated labor in cities such as London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and Liverpool. Urban infrastructure struggled to keep pace with population increases. Housing shortages, sanitation challenges, and the spread of disease prompted municipal and governmental responses, including urban planning, water supply improvements, sewage systems, and public health legislation. Public institutions, including hospitals, schools, and workhouses, expanded to meet the needs of a growing and diverse urban population. The Victorian economy integrated industrial production, domestic markets, and international trade. Britain's manufacturing output, particularly textiles, iron, and machinery, dominated European and global markets. Ports and commercial centers facilitated the export of goods and import of raw materials from colonies in India, the Caribbean, Africa, and North America. Financial institutions, including banks, joint stock companies, and insurance organizations, provided capital for industrial and colonial investment. The gold standard, standardized currency, and fiscal policy stabilized the economy and enabled government borrowing to fund infrastructure, military campaigns, and social programs. Colonial expansion was a defining feature of Victorian Britain. The empire grew substantially in India, Africa, the Pacific, and the Caribbean. Administration combined direct rule, as in India under the British Raj following the revolt of 1857 AD, with indirect governance through local rulers and protectorates and princely states. Colonial policy emphasized resource extraction, trade regulation, strategic defense, and cultural influence, including missionary activity and educational initiatives. The Royal Navy maintained security of maritime trade routes, enforced imperial authority, and supported expeditionary campaigns. Imperial expansion reinforced Britain's global economic position and political influence, allowing integration of resources, labor, and markets into the national economy. Military and naval development continued to support the empire and national security. Technological innovation, including rifled artillery, steam-powered ships, and rail logistics, enhanced operational capability. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, demonstrated logistical coordination, medical and engineering challenges, and the use of modernized weaponry in combined land and naval operations. Subsequent campaigns in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East utilized similar advancements, emphasizing strategic mobility, global reach, and the projection of British influence. Professionalization of the officer corps, regularized training, and coordination between the Army and Navy facilitated sustained military operations across multiple continents. Political institutions evolved in response to demographic change, industrialization, and social pressures. The Electoral Reform Acts of 1867 and 1884 expanded suffrage to a broader segment of adult males, reflecting the political influence of industrial and urban populations. The Reform Act of 1867 doubled the electorate, particularly in urban centers, while the Third Reform Act of 1884 extended voting rights in rural areas. Parliament increasingly addressed labor conditions, public health, education, and social welfare, balancing the interests of industrial capital landed property, and emerging professional and working classes. Political parties, notably the liberal and conservative parties, adapted organization and policy to these demographic shifts, strengthening parliamentary governance. Social and demographic transformation was significant. Population growth and urbanization created a complex social hierarchy. Industrial workers, artisans, merchants, and professionals formed distinct classes, while traditional landed gentry and aristocracy maintained influence in rural regions. Education expanded through the Elementary Education Act of 1870, establishing compulsory schooling for children and increasing literacy and technical proficiency. Women's access to education improved gradually, though political and property rights remained restricted. Urban migration, industrial employment, and technological infrastructure reshaped family structures, labor patterns, and community organization. Technological and scientific advancement accelerated in the Victorian era. Railways, canals, and improved roads facilitated domestic and international commerce, labor mobility, and territorial integration. Telegraph networks enhanced communication across Britain and its empire. Advances in medicine, including vaccination, sanitation, and surgical techniques, reduced mortality and increased life expectancy. Scientific research, supported by institutions such as the Royal Society, promoted industrial innovation, public health, and global navigation. Engineering projects, including bridges, ports, and factories, reflected both technological progress and administrative capacity to manage large-scale infrastructure. Cultural and intellectual life expanded. Literature, journalism, and public debate reflected industrial, social, and scientific development. Figures such as Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, George Eliot, and Alfred Tennyson documented social conditions, cultural transformation, and historical consciousness. Museums, libraries, and educational societies proliferated, promoting access to knowledge, artistic engagement, and historical awareness. Cultural institutions reflected industrial prosperity, urban concentration, and imperial pride, contributing to social cohesion and national identity. Religious life continued to shape public and private life. The Church of England maintained an established position, while nonconformist denominations, including Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists, expanded influence through chapels, schools, and charitable organizations. Catholic emancipation in 1829 AD had allowed full civil rights for Catholics, facilitating integration into public and professional life. Missionary activity abroad, often aligned with colonial administration, extended religious influence and educational systems across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Religious institutions also promoted moral standards, social discipline, and civic participation within domestic society. Industrial and urban expansion created social challenges. Child labor, poor working conditions, and urban poverty prompted legislative and charitable responses. The Factory Acts regulated hours, conditions, and the age of workers. Public health legislation addressed sanitation, water supply, and housing quality. Charitable organizations, voluntary associations, and local governance sought to manage social welfare, alleviate hardship, and maintain social stability. Trade unions emerged gradually, advocating for labor rights, wage security, and working conditions, laying the foundations for organized labor movements in the 20th century. Economic integration extended beyond Britain to global markets. Industrial production, colonial resources, and international trade interconnected domestic and imperial economies. Britain imported raw materials such as cotton from India and Egypt, sugar from the Caribbean, and timber and minerals from Africa and North America. Manufactured goods, particularly textiles, iron products, and machinery, were exported globally, reinforcing Britain's position as a leading industrial power. Commercial networks, financial institutions, and shipping infrastructure supported the flow of capital, labor, and goods, enabling sustained economic growth. The empire faced internal and external challenges. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, conflict in Africa, and competition with European powers necessitated administrative, military, and logistical adaptation. Britain implemented systematic colonial governance, including codified legal frameworks, taxation systems, and the integration of local elites into administration. Diplomatic engagement, treaties, and strategic alliances ensured Britain maintained influence over contested regions, protecting trade routes and resource access. These measures reinforced imperial cohesion and supported economic and military objectives. By 1901 AD, at the death of Queen Victoria, Britain had become a global industrial, economic, and imperial power. The United Kingdom maintained extensive overseas territories, a leading industrial economy, technological and scientific advancement, and mature parliamentary institutions. Urbanization, social reform, and public infrastructure had transformed domestic society, while naval and military capabilities ensured global influence. The cultural, intellectual, and scientific legacy of Victorian Britain shaped governance, education, and industrial development into the 20th century, positioning the nation for continued engagement in global affairs. The Edwardian period, spanning 1901 to 1910, followed the death of Queen Victoria and the accession of King Edward VII. It represented a transitional phase in British history, marked by social change, technological advancement, imperial consolidation, and political reform, bridging the height of Victorian industrial and imperial achievement with the challenges of the early 20th century. Edwardian Britain continued to consolidate the constitutional monarchy, parliamentary governance, and imperial administration developed during the Victorian era, while responding to new social, political, and international pressures. Edward VII assumed the throne in 1901 after the death of his mother, Queen Victoria, whose long reign had established Britain as a global industrial and imperial power. Edward's reign, though brief, reflected changes in court life, diplomatic engagement, and domestic policy. The monarch's role remained largely ceremonial, with political authority exercised through cabinet government and parliamentary institutions. The period saw continued consolidation of party politics, with the Conservative Party and Liberal Party vying for parliamentary dominance, reflecting the growing influence of urban and industrial constituencies. The Edwardian era coincided with significant demographic and social change. Britain's population had reached approximately 40 million by the early 20th century, with increasing urban concentration in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, and other industrial centers. Urban expansion created challenges in housing, sanitation, and public health, which prompted municipal reforms and legislative action. The Education Act of 1902 standardized secondary education, providing broader access to schooling and technical instruction, while literacy and professional training continued to expand across social classes. Women's education advanced, though political and legal rights remained limited. Economic activity during the Edwardian period reflected the integration of industrial production, international trade, and global finance. Britain remained the world's leading industrial power, producing textiles, coal, iron, steel, and manufactured goods. Ports and rail infrastructure facilitated both domestic distribution and global export. Financial institutions provided investment capital for industry, trade, and colonial administration. The global economy increasingly emphasized competition among industrial powers, particularly Germany and the United States, prompting strategic adaptation in manufacturing efficiency, naval production, and trade policy. Imperial administration continued to consolidate Britain's global reach. The empire encompassed territories in India, Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Southeast Asia, governed through a combination of direct rule, protectorates, and alliances with local rulers. Colonial policy emphasized economic extraction, infrastructure development, and strategic control, particularly over trade routes, raw materials, and resource-rich regions. Britain's naval dominance ensured the protection of overseas territories and facilitated the rapid deployment of military and administrative resources to maintain imperial authority. Political reforms reflected the evolving social structure. The Parliament Act of 1911, though slightly beyond the Edwardian period, had its origins in debates over the power of the House of Lords and the need to adapt governance to an expanded electorate. During Edward VII's reign, debates over suffrage, labor representation, and the role of aristocratic influence dominated political discourse. Trade unions gained influence, representing industrial workers and advocating for labor rights, working hours, and safety regulations. Social reformers promoted public health, housing, education, and welfare programs to address the disparities created by industrialization and urbanization. International relations during the Edwardian era were marked by increasing tensions among European powers. Britain pursued policies to maintain naval superiority and diplomatic influence, forming strategic alliances to balance continental rivalries. The Entente Cordiale with France, 1904, and subsequent agreements with Russia reflected Britain's desire to secure colonial interests, maintain trade routes, and prevent continental domination by any single power. Germany's naval expansion and industrial growth were perceived as a strategic challenge, prompting further investment in the Royal Navy, including the development of dreadnought-class battleships, which represented the pinnacle of naval engineering at the time. Scientific and technological innovation accelerated during the Edwardian era. Electrical power, mechanized transport, and telecommunications infrastructure expanded rapidly. Railways, telegraph networks, and early automobiles facilitated the movement of people, goods, and information. Advances in medicine, including antiseptic procedures, vaccination, and public health initiatives, reduced mortality and improved urban living conditions. Industrial engineering, mechanized production, and chemical manufacturing enhanced economic output and provided a strategic advantage in both civilian and military spheres. The Edwardian period was also defined by social stratification, cultural change, and emerging political consciousness. The aristocracy and landed gentry maintained influence, particularly in rural areas and ceremonial functions. Urban middle classes, composed of industrialists, professionals, and merchants, gained increasing economic and political leverage. Industrial laborers, concentrated in urban centers, sought collective representation through trade unions and labor organizations. Social reform movements, philanthropic organizations, and educational initiatives aim to mitigate poverty, improve living conditions, and expand opportunities for upward mobility. Women's organizations, advocating for suffrage, education, and labor rights, laid the groundwork for future political change. In 1902, the Education Act standardized administration of elementary and secondary schooling, improving literacy, technical skills, and professional training across social classes. Expansion of education supported industrial and commercial needs while fostering a more informed citizenry capable of participating in parliamentary democracy. Secondary education for girls increased gradually, contributing to the foundation for women's later political and social advancement. Public libraries, technical schools, and cultural institutions expanded access to knowledge and cultural resources. Imperial engagement during the Edwardian period continued to shape domestic and foreign policy. Britain administered India through the British Raj, overseeing law, taxation, infrastructure, and social institutions. Colonial administrators implemented reforms in education, irrigation, transportation, and public health to maintain control and facilitate economic extraction. In Africa, the consolidation of protectorates and colonies, particularly in South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, expanded Britain's strategic and economic influence. The Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, though beginning before Edward VI's accession, concluded early in his reign, confirming British control over the Transvaal and Orange Free State while revealing the logistical, political, and military challenges of colonial conflict. Lessons from the Boer War informed military reform, urban defense planning, and colonial administration. Economic policy during the Edwardian period balanced industrial production, free trade, and fiscal management. Britain maintained dominance in global trade, exporting manufactured goods and importing raw materials from colonies and partner nations. Industrial innovation and financial management supported sustained economic growth, while social reform programs sought to address urban poverty, labor conditions, and educational opportunity. Trade unions negotiated for wages, working hours, and workplace safety, reflecting the growing influence of organized labor in shaping national economic policy. International tensions escalated through the early 20th century. Germany's naval expansion, European alliances, and colonial competition created a strategic environment of uncertainty. Britain invested in the dreadnought-class battleships, ensuring continued naval superiority. Diplomatic agreements, including the Entente Cordiale and later alignment with Russia, aimed to contain continental rivalry and protect imperial interests. Military planning emphasized coordination between the Army and Navy, logistical readiness, and industrial mobilization to prepare for potential continental and global conflict. Social and cultural developments were shaped by urbanization, industrialization, and education. Literacy rates continued to increase, professional occupations expanded, and technical skills were cultivated to meet industrial and commercial needs. Public institutions, libraries, museums, and educational societies provided avenues for civic participation, cultural engagement, and knowledge dissemination. Urban planning, public sanitation, and housing reform sought to mitigate the social consequences of industrial concentration, supporting both public health and social stability. By 1910, the death of Edward VII and the accession of George V coincided with a continuation of social, political, and economic challenges inherited from the Edwardian period. Britain remained an industrial and colonial power with a growing electorate, social reform movements, and emerging labor consciousness. European rivalries, intensified militarization, and the formation of continental alliances foreshadowed the global conflict that would erupt in 1914. In 1914, following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, Britain entered World War I in response to German aggression and obligations under international alliances, including the defense of Belgium. The conflict demanded total mobilization of military, industrial, and financial resources. Britain relied on the Royal Navy to maintain supply lines, blockade enemy territories, and project power, while the British Army expanded rapidly, incorporating volunteers and conscripts. Coordination between industrial production and military logistics was crucial for sustaining prolonged combat operations on the Western Front, in the Middle East, and across colonial theaters. World War I brought extensive social and economic consequences. The mobilization of labor, the rationing of food and materials, and the regulation of industry affected daily life across Britain. Women entered industrial and clerical occupations in unprecedented numbers, maintaining production and administrative continuity while challenging traditional gender roles. The government assumed centralized control over essential industries, transportation, and communications to support war efforts, creating structures of economic management and resource allocation with long-term implications for post-war governance. Casualties and financial costs were substantial. Millions of soldiers and civilians were affected by combat, disease, and economic disruption. Key battles, including Somme, 1916, Ypres, 1914 to 1917, and Passchendaele, 1917, resulted in significant military losses while demonstrating the industrialized scale of modern warfare. The war accelerated technological innovation in weaponry, communications, and logistics, influencing military strategy and operational planning. Post-war, Britain faced reconstruction challenges, social adjustment, and the need to reintegrate returning soldiers into civilian life. Victory in 1918 concluded hostilities with the defeat of Germany and the Central Powers. Britain emerged as a principal Allied power but faced economic exhaustion, demographic losses, and social dislocation. The war's conclusion reshaped international relations, colonial administration, and domestic governance. Wartime experiences influenced labor organization, women's suffrage movements, and social policy, laying the foundations for post-war reform and political realignment. The period of interwar Britain, from 1918 to 1939, represents a complex phase of reconstruction, social transformation, economic challenge, and global repositioning following the conclusion of World War I. Britain emerged from the conflict as a victorious but financially and socially strained nation, with its industrial capacity, political institutions, and imperial administration facing unprecedented pressures. The period involved adaptation to post-war realities, management of economic depression, social reform, political evolution, and the gradual redefinition of Britain's global role within a shifting international order. The end of World War I in 1918 left Britain with severe economic and demographic consequences. Approximately 700,000 British soldiers had died during the conflict, and millions more were wounded or incapacitated. The war disrupted industry, agriculture, and infrastructure, while public debt increased dramatically due to military expenditures, wartime loans, and domestic mobilization. Inflation and currency instability affected both urban and rural populations. The government faced the dual challenge of post-war reconstruction and social integration of returning soldiers, while maintaining international influence and managing imperial obligations. The immediate post-war period involved both domestic reform and international diplomacy. Britain played a central role in the Paris Peace Conference, 1919, and the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles, influencing territorial settlements, reparations, and the League of Nations. Domestically, the Representation of the People Act 1918 expanded the electorate significantly, granting voting rights to all men over 21 and women over 30 who met property qualifications. This legislative change effectively doubled the electorate, transforming political dynamics and expanding democratic participation. The expanded electorate influenced parliamentary politics, party organization, and social policy, emphasizing the growing political importance of urban industrial populations. The post-war economy faced significant difficulties. Industrial production, particularly in coal, shipbuilding, steel, and textiles, struggled to return to pre-war levels due to international competition, disrupted trade networks, and wartime destruction. Unemployment rose in both urban and industrial regions, particularly in northern England, Wales, Scotland, and parts of Ireland. The government intervened through limited public works, social assistance programs, and financial stabilization measures, but persistent unemployment and declining wages generated social tension. Labor unrest manifested in strikes, protests, and organized industrial action, particularly during the 1926 general strike, which involved multiple sectors, including coal miners, rail workers, and transport employees. The strike reflected structural economic challenges, labor discontent, and the limitations of post-war industrial adjustment. Social change accelerated during the interwar period. The Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919 allowed women to enter the professions, participate in civil service, and access higher education, reflecting broader societal shifts following women's contributions during World War I. Women's suffrage continued to expand with the Representation of the People, Equal Franchise Act of 1928, granting voting rights to women over 21, aligning with male suffrage and completing the transition toward universal adult suffrage. Education reform, housing initiatives, and public health legislation addressed urbanization challenges, population growth, and post-war social dislocation. Housing programs, including council housing development, sought to alleviate overcrowding, improve sanitation, and provide affordable accommodation for working-class families. The Irish question dominated political and territorial restructuring during the interwar years. The Irish War of Independence, 1919 to 1921, led to the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which created the Irish Free State, 1922, as a dominion within the British Commonwealth, while Northern Ireland remained part of the United Kingdom. This settlement involved military, political, and administrative negotiation, reflecting sectarian division, colonial legacy, and nationalist aspirations. Northern Ireland developed its own devolved parliament under the Government of Ireland Act, 1920, establishing political structures distinct from the rest of the United Kingdom and influencing intercommunal relations and regional governance throughout the period. Internationally, Britain sought to maintain influence within a changing global order. Post-war settlements redistributed territories and established the League of Nations, in which Britain played a leading role. Colonial administration continued across Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific, emphasizing economic management, strategic control, and political stability. Britain's role in the Middle East expanded through mandates in Palestine, Iraq, and Transjordan, reflecting strategic interest in oil, trade routes, and regional security. Imperial governance relied on civil administration, legal codification, and limited military enforcement to integrate diverse territories into the British system. Economic and industrial modernization continued unevenly. Traditional industries in coal, shipbuilding, and textiles faced competition from emerging industrial powers, mechanization, and changing global demand. Southern England, London, and developing industrial centers saw growth in finance, service industries, light manufacturing, and transport. The introduction of automobiles, electrification, and mechanized agriculture altered production, consumption, and labor organization. Financial institutions, stock exchanges, and investment networks supported both domestic and imperial economic activity, linking Britain's economy to global markets. Political development during the interwar period reflected party evolution, expanded democracy, and a response to social pressures. The conservative and liberal parties contended with the rise of the Labour Party, which gained support from industrial laborers, trade unions, and urban populations. Parliamentary legislation addressed labor relations, social welfare, public housing, and unemployment insurance, reflecting the influence of organized labor and working-class constituencies. Political institutions adapted to demographic change, urbanization, and the expanding electorate, balancing reform with continuity in governance structures established during the 19th century. Cultural life evolved alongside industrialization and social reform. Education, literacy, and access to cultural institutions increased, producing a more informed and politically aware population. Literature, journalism, and theater addressed contemporary social issues, reflecting urban experience, industrial conditions, and post-war realities. Science, medicine, and technology advanced in response to industrial and urban demands, while professional societies and technical schools expanded knowledge dissemination. Museums, public libraries, and educational societies promoted civic education and facilitated engagement with industrial and imperial achievements. The British Empire remained central to national identity, economic stability, and strategic planning. Colonial administration involved resource extraction, infrastructure development, and limited political representation, ensuring integration into imperial economic networks. Economic and military coordination across colonies supported trade, defense, and administrative continuity. Strategic locations, including India, Egypt, South Africa, and the Caribbean, were maintained through professional military presence, naval deployment, and civil governance. Global influence depended on economic, political, and military capacity to sustain control over diverse territories and respond to both local and international challenges. Economic depression affected Britain beginning in the late 1920s, particularly following the Wall Street crash of 1929, which amplified existing structural weaknesses in the coal, steel, and textile industries. Unemployment rates in industrial regions rose to unprecedented levels, reaching approximately 2.5 million by 1932. The government implemented measures such as public works, tariffs, and financial stabilization, but structural unemployment persisted. Urban populations faced poverty, overcrowding, and inadequate social support, while rural areas struggled with agricultural decline, falling prices, and outmigration. Social pressures influenced political debates, reform proposals, and public policy development throughout the 1930s. Internationally, Britain faced rising tensions with Germany, Italy, and Japan. Aggressive foreign policies, rearmament, and territorial ambitions by these states challenged the post-World War I settlement and Britain's global influence. Diplomatic engagement, alliance building, and naval preparedness became central to national strategy. Britain participated in the League of Nations, seeking to mediate disputes, enforce peace settlements, and maintain colonial and economic interests. Despite diplomatic efforts, rising nationalism and militarization in Europe and Asia indicated the potential for renewed global conflict. Technological advancement and industrial adaptation continued throughout the interwar period. Electrification, mechanized transport, and communication systems, including radio and telephone networks, transformed commerce, governance, and social interaction. Urban planning, sanitation infrastructure, and public transportation evolved to accommodate population growth and industrial concentration. Industrial innovation, scientific research, and engineering projects strengthened domestic capacity and supported strategic military preparedness in anticipation of potential conflict. Cultural and intellectual developments reflected the social, economic, and political transformations of the period. Literature, visual arts, and theater addressed themes of industrialization, war, social reform, and imperial identity. Journalism and mass media expanded access to information, public debate, and political engagement. Education reforms, technical training, and professional development produced a skilled workforce capable of contributing to industrial, military, and administrative sectors. Civic institutions, cultural organizations, and educational societies promoted literacy, social cohesion, and national identity in a period of rapid social change. International instability, including German rearmament, Italian expansion in Africa, and Japanese aggression in Asia, required strategic planning, military preparedness, and diplomatic engagement. Domestically, Britain had developed social welfare programs, educational reforms, and labor protections, providing partial mitigation of social and economic inequality, but structural challenges remained unresolved. Britain entered the late 1930s with a complex domestic and international position. Industrial capacity, financial institutions, and imperial holdings provided resources for potential conflict, while social and political reforms addressed emerging urban, labor, and gender concerns. Parliamentary institutions, legal frameworks, and governance systems ensured continuity and adaptability. Imperial administration remained central to strategic and economic interests, linking domestic stability to global influence. The interwar period established the structural, social, and political context for Britain's response to the outbreak of World War II in 1939, when global conflict would once again redefine national priorities, economic organization, and international standing. The period of World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, represents a defining era in British history, encompassing total mobilization, global conflict, strategic military planning, and domestic transformation. Britain entered the war as one of the principal Allied powers. responding to the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany in September 1939. The period involved comprehensive political, military, economic, and social adaptation, as Britain coordinated national resources, industrial production, and colonial networks to support a global war effort. The conflict had profound consequences for the United Kingdom, reshaping domestic governance, international influence, and the post-war economic and social order. Following the invasion of Poland by Germany on September 1, 1939, Britain, honoring its obligations under the Anglo-Polish military alliance, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain led the government at the outset, transitioning national policy from appeasement to active engagement in continental conflict. Initial British strategy emphasized defensive preparation, naval control, and coordination with France and the Commonwealth, forming a coalition capable of confronting German expansion in Europe. Strategic planning involved coordination between the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the British Army, integrating intelligence, logistics, and industrial production to sustain long-term operations. Britain's geographical position enabled defensive advantage and facilitated naval control over the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. The Royal Navy, at the outset of the war, consisted of approximately 400 vessels, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, enabling control of sea lanes and protection of maritime commerce. The naval blockade of Germany sought to limit access to raw materials, industrial inputs, and strategic resources. The British merchant fleet, coordinated with naval escorts, maintained vital supply chains for both domestic consumption and military operations. Maritime logistics supported the deployment of troops, equipment, and material across Europe, Africa, and Asia. The early phase of the war, known as the Phoney War, 1939 to 1940, involved limited continental engagement. Britain prepared defenses, expanded military recruitment, and implemented civil defense measures. Industrial capacity shifted to wartime production, converting factories to manufacture aircraft, armaments, ships, vehicles, and munitions. Research and development in radar, aviation, cryptography, and mechanized warfare enhanced operational effectiveness. Military intelligence, coordinated through MI6, Bletchley Park, and domestic surveillance, provided a strategic assessment of German intentions, technological developments, and battlefield deployments. In 1940, Germany's offensive across Western Europe, including the invasion of France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, escalated the conflict. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain isolated as the principal European power opposing Germany. Evacuation of British expeditionary forces from Dunkirk, May 26, June 4, 1940, preserved over 330,000 troops, demonstrating organizational capacity, naval coordination, and logistical planning. Britain's ability to maintain its army, rebuild defensive capacity, and reorganize industrial production proved critical to continued resistance. The Battle of Britain, July-October 1940, marked the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces. The Royal Air Force, utilizing advanced radar detection, integrated fighter command, and effective aircraft design, successfully repelled the Luftwaffe, preventing German invasion and securing Britain's defensive position. Civilian preparedness, including the operation of the Air Raid Precautions (ERP) services, reinforced defensive measures. Bombing raids during the Blitz, September 1940 to May 1941, targeted urban and industrial centers, resulting in substantial civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, and disruption of production. Adaptation included dispersion of industry, civil defense coordination, and rationing of resources to maintain civilian resilience and support the war economy. Britain's industrial and technological adaptation was central to wartime capability. Factory conversion emphasized mass production of aircraft, tanks, artillery, and small arms. Coordination between government agencies, industry, and scientific institutions increased efficiency and innovation. Radar, developed at Bodsey Manor and operationally integrated by Fighter Command, enabled early detection of enemy aircraft. Cryptographic advances at Bletchley Park, including the decryption of Enigma-encoded communications, provided critical intelligence for naval and military operations, reducing shipping losses and informing strategic planning. Military operations extended globally, reflecting Britain's imperial reach. Forces were deployed across North Africa, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The North African Campaign, 1940 to 1943, involving British, Commonwealth, and Allied forces, aimed to counter German and Italian advances, secure the Suez Canal, and maintain access to Middle Eastern oil. Operational planning integrated combined arms, supply logistics, and coordination with Commonwealth troops from Australia, Canada, India, and South Africa. In Asia, the Japanese advance, including the fall of Singapore, 1942, necessitated strategic redeployment and adaptation, highlighting the challenges of defending imperial possessions across extensive territories. Domestic governance adapted to the demands of total war. Centralized authority expanded under the wartime coalition government led by Winston Churchill from 1940 AD. Ministries for food, fuel, transport, and production coordinated resource allocation, rationing, and industrial output. Civilian labor, including women and youth, was mobilized to support munitions production, transportation, agriculture, and medical services. Wartime legislation regulated wages, prices, and employment conditions, ensuring industrial efficiency while maintaining social stability. Public morale was sustained through government communication, propaganda, and promotion of national solidarity. Economic mobilization relied on both domestic production and imperial resources. Britain imported food, raw materials, and strategic commodities from colonies, dominions, and the United States under the Lend-Lease program after 1941. Industrial production expanded to meet military demand, including the manufacture of aircraft such as the Spitfire and Hurricane, armored vehicles, naval vessels, and munitions. Coordination between scientific research, engineering expertise, and industrial capacity facilitated continuous innovation, improving efficiency, output, and battlefield effectiveness. Casualties and social impact were extensive. Civilian populations faced aerial bombardment, evacuation, rationing, and displacement, while military personnel experienced high attrition across multiple theaters. Medical services, hospitals, and emergency response systems were expanded and modernized to address both battlefield and domestic needs. Demographic shifts occurred due to conscription, migration, and industrial employment, while women's participation in the workforce permanently altered social and occupational structures. Allied coordination was central to military strategy. Britain collaborated with the United States, the Soviet Union, and Commonwealth forces to conduct joint operations, including the North African landings, the Italian campaign, 1943 to 1945, and planning for the D-Day invasion, June 6, 1944. Strategic bombing campaigns targeted German industrial capacity, transportation networks, and military infrastructure, integrating air power, intelligence, and operational planning. Naval engagements, including the Battle of the Atlantic, maintained critical supply lines while countering submarine threats from the Kriegsmarine. Technological innovation continued throughout the conflict. Development of radar, sonar, advanced aircraft, mechanized vehicles, and weapons systems enhanced operational capacity across land, sea, and air theaters. Cryptographic intelligence, particularly the decryption of Enigma and Lorenz codes, informed strategic planning, convoy protection, and amphibious operations. Medical advances, including antibiotics, trauma care, and surgical techniques, improved survival rates for soldiers and civilians. Industrial research and development sustained production efficiency and facilitated rapid adaptation to emerging battlefield requirements. Britain's global role was reinforced through imperial and Commonwealth participation. Troops, material support, and logistical coordination from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and African colonies were integrated into military campaigns across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Colonial administrations coordinated local governance, labor supply, and resource extraction to support both domestic and overseas war efforts. The imperial network provided strategic depth, material resources, and personnel critical to sustaining the global campaign against the Axis powers. By 1945, the war had concluded with the defeat of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Britain emerged victorious as one of the principal Allied powers, but faced significant challenges. Extensive economic depletion, wartime debt, damaged infrastructure, and population losses required comprehensive post-war reconstruction. Industrial capacity, though technologically advanced, had been diverted to military production, necessitating conversion to peacetime activity. Social adjustment involved the reintegration of military personnel, management of urban reconstruction, and expansion of public services to accommodate population needs. The post-war consequences of World War II were extensive. Politically, Britain maintained its role as a global leader, though relative influence declined compared to emerging superpowers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. Socially, wartime experiences catalyzed reform, including the creation of the welfare state, expanded health services, housing programs, and social insurance, laying the foundations for post-war domestic policy. Economically, Britain faced debt, currency challenges, and the need for industrial modernization, prompting engagement with international financial institutions and global markets to stabilize growth. Demographically, the war affected labor structure, population distribution, and social dynamics. Women's wartime employment continued into post-war industries, contributing to shifts in occupational opportunity and societal expectations. Urban populations were reshaped by evacuation programs, wartime destruction, and reconstruction efforts. Education and technical training expanded to support industrial redevelopment, while health services responded to wartime casualties and post-war public health needs. Internationally, Britain participated in the creation of the United Nations, 1945, contributing to frameworks for post-war diplomacy, collective security, and international law. Imperial administration began a process of transition toward decolonization, reflecting both economic constraints and nationalist movements within colonies. Strategic realignment emphasized partnerships with the United States and Commonwealth nations, reflecting changes in global power distribution. The consequences of World War II redefined Britain's political, economic, and social landscape. The conflict accelerated centralization of governance, technological innovation, industrial capacity, and social reform. Imperial networks were tested, reshaped, and gradually reoriented toward post-war reconstruction and decolonization. Domestic institutions adapted to manage population needs, labor organization, and public services. Britain's global position, while still influential, required strategic recalibration in response to emerging superpowers, changing trade networks, and shifting geopolitical realities. The period from post-war to modern Britain, covering 1945 to the present, represents a phase of reconstruction, political transformation, economic adaptation, social reform, and redefinition of national and global identity. Britain emerged from World War II victorious, but economically exhausted, socially transformed, and facing the decline of imperial authority. The country underwent structural changes in governance, industrial organization, social welfare, and international relations, while navigating the challenges of decolonization, European integration, technological modernization, and domestic political evolution. In 1945, Britain faced immense post-war challenges. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, won the general election, reflecting public demand for reconstruction, social welfare, and modernization. The government implemented comprehensive reforms to address wartime deprivation, including nationalization of key industries such as coal, steel, and railways. The National Health Service, NHS, established in 1948, provided free health care at the point of delivery, funded through taxation, representing a major expansion of state responsibility and social protection. Social housing programs, education reform, and welfare provisions sought to mitigate poverty, address urban overcrowding, and support population health. Britain's post-war economy required reconstruction of industrial infrastructure, energy supply, and transportation networks damaged or redirected during the war. Nationalization and centralized planning facilitated coordinated recovery, while private enterprise remained integral to commercial activity. The post-war period emphasized reconstruction of housing, factories, and public utilities alongside expansion of technological capacity in engineering, communications, and chemical production. Industrial regions, particularly in the north of England, Wales, and Scotland, were focal points for rebuilding, modernization, and labor organization. Decolonization significantly altered Britain's global position. In 1947, India and Pakistan gained independence, ending direct British rule on the subcontinent. The process continued through the 1950s and 1960s, with colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia achieving independence. Britain transitioned from a direct imperial power to a member of the Commonwealth of Nations, maintaining diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties with former colonies. Decolonization reshaped foreign policy, trade networks, and military commitments, while prompting domestic debates on immigration, identity, and multicultural integration. The post-war period also included adjustments to the emerging global order dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain participated in the formation of the United Nations, 1945, and NATO, 1949, maintaining influence in collective security arrangements and international diplomacy. Strategic priorities included European reconstruction, management of the declining empire, nuclear capability, and participation in multilateral institutions. Britain retained responsibilities in Germany, the Middle East, and Asia, while gradually withdrawing military presence from former colonies. Economic change was accompanied by technological modernization. The 1950s and 1960s saw expansion in electronics, telecommunications, aerospace, and industrial engineering. Domestic infrastructure, including transportation, energy, and urban planning, was modernized. The post-war welfare state facilitated social stability and labor productivity, while education expansion, including universities and technical colleges, supported workforce development. Industrial decline in traditional sectors, particularly coal, steel, and textiles, prompted regional economic restructuring and diversification. Political transformation characterized the latter half of the 20th century. Britain alternated between Labour and Conservative governments, reflecting democratic engagement and policy debate over economic management, welfare provision, and social reform. Legislation addressed housing, education, health, labor rights, and civil liberties, adapting governance structures to post-war realities. Devolution for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, established in the late 1990s, redistributed legislative authority, reflecting regional identity, political pluralism, and administrative decentralization. Social transformation accelerated through the post-war decades. Immigration from former colonies, particularly the Caribbean, India, and Pakistan, reshaped urban demographics, labor markets, and cultural composition. Civil rights, anti-discrimination legislation, and multicultural policy evolved to address social integration, labor participation, and political representation. Women's participation in the workforce increased, accompanied by legal reforms such as the Equal Pay Act, 1970, and the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975, supporting gender equality in employment, education, and public life. Social mobility, urban planning, and access to education expanded opportunity, while industrial decline and regional disparities continued to challenge domestic policy. Britain's economic trajectory included cycles of growth, stagnation, and restructuring. Post-war industrial growth was supported by reconstruction and technological modernization, but the 1970s experienced economic turbulence, including inflation, unemployment, and energy crises. Membership in the European Economic Community, 1973, integrated Britain into continental markets, facilitating trade, investment, and regulatory alignment. Industrial restructuring, financialization, and service sector expansion in the 1980s and 1990s transformed employment patterns, urban development, and regional economic balance. The government pursued privatization of utilities, deregulation, and liberalization of markets, reflecting a shift from centralized planning to market-oriented policy. Internationally, Britain participated in military and diplomatic alliances, peacekeeping, and global institutions. Conflicts, including the Falklands War, 1982, engagements in the Middle East, and involvement in NATO operations, reflected strategic priorities, alliance commitments, and defense policy. Britain maintained nuclear capability, modernized armed forces, and coordinated with Commonwealth and allied nations. Diplomatic engagement included negotiation over European integration, decolonization, trade relations, and global security, reflecting Britain's adaptation to a multipolar world. Cultural and scientific development continued alongside economic and political change. Expansion of universities, research institutions, and technical education supported innovation in medicine, engineering, information technology, and environmental management. Arts, literature, theater, and media reflected social, political, and technological evolution. Public institutions, libraries, and museums contributed to civic education, historical awareness, and national identity. Technological adoption, including television, computers, and telecommunications, transformed communication, commerce, and education. Britain's relationship with Europe evolved over successive decades. Entry into the European Economic Community in 1973 aligned Britain economically with continental markets, although political debates over sovereignty and regulation persisted. In 2016, a referendum resulted in a decision to leave the European Union, formally completed in 2020, reflecting domestic political realignment, regional differences, and debates over global trade, immigration, and sovereignty. These decisions continued to shape economic, political, and social policy into the 21st century. Governance in post-war Britain combined continuity of constitutional monarchy with parliamentary democracy. The monarch remained a ceremonial head of state, while political authority resided with Parliament and the Cabinet. Devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland provided regional legislative powers, reflecting political pluralism and administrative adaptation. Local government, judicial institutions, and regulatory bodies coordinated with national policy to implement social, economic, and legal frameworks. Constitutional arrangements evolved to accommodate European integration, devolution, and modern democratic practice. Economic modernization continued into the 21st century, emphasizing knowledge-based industries, finance, services, and information technology. Traditional manufacturing sectors declined relative to global competitors, prompting regional economic diversification and investment in infrastructure, education, and research. London emerged as a global financial center, while regional development initiatives addressed disparities in employment, skills, and investment. International trade, investment flows, and participation in global supply chains sustained economic relevance and contributed to national revenue. Social policy evolved in response to demographic, cultural, and economic change. Healthcare, education, housing, and welfare programs expanded to accommodate population growth, aging demographics, and technological requirements. Immigration and cultural diversity reshaped urban life, labor markets, and social institutions, requiring policy adaptation to maintain social cohesion and economic participation. Gender equality, labor rights, and civil liberties were codified through legislation, judicial interpretation, and social practice, reflecting long-term trends initiated in post-war reconstruction. Scientific and technological advancement supported Britain's adaptation to global change. Research in medicine, computing, aerospace, and environmental science facilitated industrial modernization, public health improvement, and infrastructure development. Universities, research councils, and industry collaboration supported innovation and knowledge dissemination. Adoption of digital technology, telecommunications, and information systems transformed communication, commerce, education, and governance, integrating Britain into global technological networks. Britain's role in international affairs included diplomacy, economic engagement, humanitarian assistance, and strategic alliances. Membership in the United Nations, NATO, and international financial institutions enabled influence in global security, trade, and development. Post-war decolonization, European integration, and multilateral diplomacy reflected adaptation to a world in which power was distributed among multiple states, including the United States, the European Union, and emerging economies. Britain maintained both national sovereignty and global engagement through strategic policy, negotiation, and cooperation. The period from 1945 to the present demonstrates a continuum of adaptation, reform, and modernization. Post-war reconstruction, welfare state establishment, decolonization, European integration, economic restructuring, technological adoption, and social transformation reflect the ability of Britain to adjust to domestic and global pressures. Governance, law, and institutions evolved while retaining historical continuity, balancing central authority with regional autonomy, democratic participation, and social welfare provision. Britain's contemporary society reflects the cumulative effects of industrial, imperial, and political history. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, legal systems, and civic institutions continue to provide governance, stability, and continuity. Economic transformation, technological innovation, and social reform underpin domestic development, while international diplomacy, military alliances, and trade relations define global influence. Regional identities, cultural diversity, and political pluralism shape domestic policy, reflecting historical legacies and contemporary adaptation. Industrial regions, financial centers, and service-based economies coexist, reflecting the structural transformation from a manufacturing-centered economy to a diversified knowledge and service economy. Urban development, transportation networks, and digital infrastructure support economic activity, connectivity, and regional integration. Education, research, and technical training provide skilled labor, innovation, and intellectual resources necessary for competitive participation in global markets. Demographically, Britain experienced population growth, urban concentration, immigration, and an aging population. Social policy, healthcare provision, and infrastructure development evolved to address these changes, ensuring continuity of service delivery and social stability. Cultural life, media, and public discourse adapted to technological change, global connectivity, and increased social mobility. Regional and national identities coexisted with broader participation in global economic, political, and cultural systems. Britain's constitutional framework maintained continuity of monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and rule of law while accommodating devolution, judicial oversight, and legislative reform. Political parties, elections, and civic engagement provided mechanisms for representation, accountability, and policy formation. Social and economic policy adapted to global change, demographic transformation, and technological advancement. The integration of domestic and foreign policy priorities reflected Britain's continued role as both a national and international actor. By the early 21st century, Britain had transitioned from a global empire to a modern state characterized by democratic institutions, welfare provision, technological capacity, and international engagement. Regional governance, legal systems, economic diversification, and social reform demonstrate adaptation to historical, political, and economic pressures. Britain's contemporary status reflects centuries of historical development, shaped by industrialization, empire, conflict, and reform, integrated with modern social, economic, and technological realities. The historical trajectory of Britain, from prehistoric settlement to the modern era, has produced a legacy that extends far beyond its geographic boundaries. Britain's influence, built through centuries of political development, legal innovation, industrial expansion, cultural production, and imperial engagement, has shaped global systems, governance structures, and societal norms. The nation's history reflects continuity of institutional development, adaptation to changing internal and external pressures, and sustained participation in global networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Central to Britain's global legacy is its political and legal framework. The evolution of constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and common law has provided a model of governance widely adopted or adapted internationally. The Magna Carta of 1215 AD established the principle of limits on sovereign authority, influencing legal thought in Europe and later in colonies. The development of representative institutions, including parliament, local councils, and judicial oversight, demonstrated enduring mechanisms for accountability, lawmaking, and civic participation. These frameworks influenced political structures in North America, Australasia, Africa, and Asia, contributing to the formation of democratic institutions in former colonies and beyond. Britain's imperial and colonial history shaped global economic and political systems. The establishment of trade networks, administrative structures, and legal institutions across Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania integrated diverse regions into a global framework of commerce, governance, and communication. The British Empire facilitated the movement of goods, labor, and capital on an unprecedented scale, creating infrastructure, ports, and transport systems that persisted after decolonization. Colonial administration promoted English as a lingua franca, codified legal systems, and introduced bureaucratic and educational institutions that continued to influence post-colonial governance. Industrialization represents another fundamental component of Britain's legacy. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the 18th century, established Britain as the first nation to mechanize production on a mass scale. Technological innovations in textile manufacture, iron production, steam engines, and railways set global benchmarks for industrial development. Industrialization transformed social structures, urban planning, labor organization, and economic practices, providing a model subsequently adopted across Europe, North America, and beyond. Britain's industrial methodologies, combined with engineering, scientific research, and manufacturing expertise, shaped global patterns of production, trade, and technological diffusion. Culturally, Britain's contribution encompasses literature, science, philosophy, education, and media. The works of authors, scientists, and thinkers, ranging from William Shakespeare to Isaac Newton to Charles Darwin, influenced intellectual, artistic, and scientific developments worldwide. British educational institutions, including universities such as Oxford, Cambridge, and Edinburgh, produced scholars whose work was disseminated globally. The English language, through literature, administration, commerce, and colonization, became a global medium of communication, facilitating the exchange of ideas, business, and culture. Britain's military and naval history also contributes to its global influence. Maritime dominance established in the 18th and 19th centuries enabled the protection of trade routes, projection of power, and strategic control over global choke points. Naval innovation, shipbuilding techniques, and global logistics informed military theory and practice internationally. British participation in the two world wars, the creation of NATO, and coordination within Commonwealth defense structures positioned the nation as a central actor in global security arrangements, influencing post-war international order and conflict resolution. The evolution of the welfare state and social policy represents a domestic innovation with global resonance. Post-World War II reforms, including the National Health Service, social housing, education provision, and labor protections, provided models of state-supported social infrastructure. These policies influenced international approaches to healthcare, education, labor law, and social welfare, demonstrating the capacity of governance to address social equity and population well-being. The integration of public administration, civil services, and policy frameworks provided a template for efficient state intervention in social and economic affairs. Britain's legal traditions remain a cornerstone of its international influence. Common law principles, judicial precedent, and codification of civil and commercial law were transmitted through colonial administration and global commerce. These systems underpin legal frameworks in nations across the Commonwealth, including Canada, Australia, India, and parts of Africa, providing continuity in property rights, contracts, judicial procedures, and civil liberties. International arbitration, trade law, and corporate regulation have also drawn on British legal methods, reinforcing the global reach of institutional practices established over centuries. Scientific and technological contributions reflect cumulative historical development. Industrialization, scientific research, and education produced innovations in engineering, medicine, transportation, and communication that shaped global progress. British inventors, scientists, and engineers developed technologies that facilitated industrial efficiency, urbanization, military capability, and global trade. The dissemination of technical knowledge through publications, professional societies, and international collaboration reinforced Britain's centrality in scientific and industrial networks. Britain's approach to governance and diplomacy has shaped international relations. From the balance of power diplomacy of the 18th and 19th centuries to 20th century multilateral engagement, British foreign policy emphasized strategic negotiation, treaty-making, and alliance building. Participation in the League of Nations, the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union reflects continuity of engagement with collective security and global governance frameworks. Diplomatic practice, legal codification, and negotiation methodology established precedents for international conduct, contributing to conflict resolution, trade regulation, and cooperative governance. The British Empire's global trade networks influenced economic development far beyond the British Isles. Infrastructure, including ports, railways, canals, and telegraph systems, facilitated international commerce, resource extraction, and industrial expansion. Financial institutions, banking practices, and insurance networks developed in Britain supported global trade, investment, and industrial finance. Economic models established during the imperial period provided structural frameworks for global capitalism, commercial law, and corporate practice, impacting both former colonies and international markets. Culturally, Britain contributed to the global dissemination of language, media, and education. English became the principal language of international communication, science, diplomacy, and commerce. Literature, theater, music, and visual arts, spanning the medieval period to contemporary media, provided intellectual and aesthetic influence worldwide. Educational institutions, from primary schooling to universities, produced intellectual capital and standardized curricula that informed colonial, post-colonial, and international education systems. Media, including print, broadcasting, and digital platforms, have extended British cultural influence into the 21st century. Britain's global scientific and exploratory legacy also includes maritime exploration, cartography, and natural science. British navigators and scientists mapped coastlines, oceans, and continents, contributing to global geographic knowledge. Scientific expeditions advanced understanding in geology, biology, and meteorology, providing foundations for subsequent academic and practical applications. Institutions such as the Royal Society coordinated research, facilitated knowledge dissemination, and promoted scientific innovation with international impact. Political thought originating in Britain influenced constitutional, democratic, and legal developments worldwide. Principles of parliamentary democracy, separation of powers, constitutional monarchy, and representative government were transmitted through colonial governance, legal codification, and post-imperial adaptation. Political theorists, legal scholars, and statesmen contributed to concepts of governance, civic rights, and public accountability that informed constitutional drafting and democratic evolution in nations across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In the post-imperial era, Britain's legacy is both tangible and institutional. Urban planning, industrial infrastructure, legal systems, educational institutions, and parliamentary frameworks established during imperial and post-war periods continue to shape domestic and international environments. The Commonwealth provides an enduring network of states with historical, cultural, and political links, facilitating cooperation, trade, and diplomatic engagement. Britain's historical trajectory illustrates the integration of domestic policy, international influence, and cultural production in the shaping of a global legacy. Britain's adaptation to technological, economic, and social change ensured continuity and resilience. Industrialization, urbanization, scientific advancement, and political reform enabled the country to maintain relevance despite shifts in global power structures. Integration of social policy, legal institutions, and governance structures provided stability and facilitated international engagement. Educational and scientific networks ensured knowledge transfer, innovation, and capacity for sustained influence in global economic, cultural, and political spheres. The cumulative historical experience demonstrates that Britain's global legacy is the product of centuries of conquest, governance, industrialization, reform, and international engagement. From prehistoric settlement to modern parliamentary democracy, Britain shaped law, governance, technology, industry, and culture in ways that persist globally. Its language, institutions, legal systems, scientific contributions, and political models continue to influence international standards, education, commerce, and governance. Britain's global influence is reflected in both structural and intangible domains. Physical infrastructure, including ports, railways, and urban planning, facilitated global connectivity and trade. Institutional frameworks, encompassing law, governance, and public administration, guided political and economic development worldwide. Cultural and intellectual output, including literature, science, and education, informed global knowledge networks and professional standards. Imperial, colonial, and post-imperial interactions created lasting patterns of trade, migration, and communication. Contemporary Britain maintains this legacy while adapting to modern challenges. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and common law provide continuity, while devolution, social reform, and economic modernization ensure responsiveness to demographic and political change. International engagement through the Commonwealth, United Nations, NATO, and global trade networks reflects both historical continuity and strategic adaptation. Cultural production, education, and scientific innovation sustain global relevance in the 21st century. Britain's historical trajectory demonstrates the integration of domestic development, international influence, and institutional resilience. Its legacy is measurable through the diffusion of language, governance, law, trade, technology, education, and culture. The cumulative impact of centuries of political reform, industrialization, social policy, and global engagement positions Britain as a reference point for understanding the evolution of modern states and global networks. Through centuries of adaptation, reform, and institutional development, Britain has produced a global legacy that continues to influence law, governance, economic structures, cultural production, scientific development, and international relations. This legacy is inseparable from its historical trajectory, encompassing the cumulative effects of conquest, colonization, industrialization, war, reform, and modernization. The nation's ability to integrate historical experience into contemporary policy, governance, and global engagement demonstrates continuity and resilience, providing a framework for understanding both national identity and international influence in the modern world.